The rain came sideways. 9 riders broke the ridgeline under a sky the color of an old bruise, rifles already unslung, the lead horse's hooves striking sparks from wet stone. Below them, the well-weighted stone lip cracked, water running clear for the first time in 11 years, steam rising into the storm like breath from something that refused to stay buried. A single figure stood at its edge, not crouched, not hidden, taller than the doorway behind her, shoulders wide enough to block the lightning when it split the dark. Rain streamed down a face that had spent 6 years being called a monster and had finally stopped answering to the name. Behind the new barn frame, shadows shifted neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid her, now holding rifles of their own. The riders reined up 30 yards out. The first shot cracked high and wild. The second found flesh. And the woman who had thrown herself between a falling tree and a stranger she barely knew dropped to one knee in the mud, blood already darkening her sleeve, while the whole valley held its breath and waited to learn which story would still be standing when the storm finally broke. The wind came first. Not a breeze, not the kind that cools a man's neck after a long ride. This wind had teeth. It came off the flats of Widow's Basin, dragging dust and dead grass and the smell of something that used to be alive. Elias Barrow rode into it with his hat pulled low and his collar turned up, and he did not look away, because looking away was a habit he'd broken years ago. In the war, on the plains after the war. Out here, a man learned fast that the land didn't care if he flinched. The valley opened below him like a wound that never closed, cracked earth. Fence posts leaning sideways, half of them down. The wire between them curled and rusted into something that looked less like a boundary and more like a scar. A barn with its roof caved in on one side, black timbers reaching up like fingers, and at the center of it all, a well. Just a well. Stone ring, dry mouth, dust where water should have been. Elias stopped his horse at the top of the ridge and sat there a long moment. Not moving, just looking, dead hollow. That's what the man in town called it. Except the paper he'd signed said something else. Said Briar Hollow Ranch. Said it belonged to him now for $11 and the price of his pride. He didn't know yet which name was true. The town was called Coldwater Flat, though there was nothing cold about it and nothing flat about the way the men inside the land office looked at him when he walked in. "You the one asking after the hollow place?" The clerk didn't look up, just kept scratching numbers into a ledger, like the numbers mattered more than the man standing in front of him. "I am, $11. The clerk said it like a joke he'd told 100 times and never tired of. $11 for 600 acres. You know why it's $11? I can guess. Bet you. The clerk finally looked up, grinned. Not a kind grin. Well's been dry 11 years. Ground won't hold a crop. And there's something living up on that ridge behind the old cabin that ain't exactly Christian. Elias didn't answer right away. He'd learned that too. Silence made men say more than questions did. Some folks call her a monster. A man by the door spoke up now, older, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, whittling something that had stopped looking like anything useful a while back. 7 foot if she's an inch. Maybe more. Shoulders on her like a draft horse. Been up on that hill going on 6 years now. Scares off every fool who buys the place. How many fools is that? You'd be the 4th. Elias set the coins on the counter. One at a time. Let them ring against the wood. Then I suppose I'm due for some luck. The men laughed. Not cruel exactly. Just the laugh of people who'd already decided how his story ended and were only sticking around to watch it happen. He signed the paper anyway, his hand steady, his face giving nothing back. Because what none of them knew, what he'd never once said out loud, not to the clerk, not to the man with the whittling knife, not to anyone since it happened, was that he'd already buried everything a man could bury. A wife. A stretch of Kansas dirt that used to be green. A herd that dropped dead one by one over a summer so dry the creek beds cracked into puzzle pieces. So $11 and a curse didn't scare him. What scared him was the quiet after. The kind that came when a man had nothing left to lose and had to go find something anyway. Just to have a reason to wake up. He rode out that afternoon with what he owned strapped to one horse and a spare mule trailing behind, and he did not look back at Coldwater Flat once. The cabin, when he reached it, was worse up close than it had looked from the ridge. Roof half gone. Door hanging on one hinge, swinging slow in the wind like it was breathing inside. Dust thick enough to write his name in. And something had been nesting in the mattress ticking long before he arrived. He didn't mind. He'd slept in worse. What he minded was the well. He walked to it first, before he even unloaded the mule, stood at the stone lip and looked down into a throat of darkness that gave nothing back. No glint. No damp smell rising up the working well breathed, cool and alive. Just dry stone, and dust and a silence that felt less like absence and more like something waiting. He dropped a pebble in, counted, one, three. The sound, when it landed, was wrong. Too soft. Too final. Like it had struck bone instead of stone. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself the same thing 3 more times before he believed it enough to walk away. Nightfall came fast in the basin. No long gold hour like back east. Just day and then not day. All at once, like someone had blown out a lamp. Elias built his fire small and low, the way he'd learned in the cavalry, enough to warm his hands, not enough to announce himself to the whole valley. He ate hardtack and dried beef and listened to the wind pick at the broken shutters like fingers testing a lock. And that was when he heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal's. Too heavy, too even. Too deliberate for coyote or deer. A rhythm to it. Left, right, left. Pausing sometimes like something out there was choosing where to put its so it wouldn't be heard and failing, because the ground itself seemed to answer each step with a low shudder that Elias felt more than heard, through his boots up through the dirt. He didn't move. Hand found the rifle beside him. Didn't lift it. Not yet. Because the steps stopped. Right at the edge of the firelight. Just past where the glow gave out and the dark took over completely. And he could feel, not see. Feel that something out there was standing still. Watching. The way a held breath watches a room. I know you're there. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Whatever you are. Nothing answered. But the weight of being watched didn't lift either. It sat on him the rest of the night. Through every hour he told himself he wasn't going to sleep, and then somehow did in fits, waking each time to the same dark, the same wind, the same sense that the valley had eyes and every one of them was on him. By morning the footsteps were gone. But in the dust past the fire ring, pressed deep into the cracked earth, there was a boot print, one boot print, twice the size of his own. Elias stood over that print a long time, because a boot print meant a person, and a person meant answers. And answers were a thing he hadn't had much of in 3 years, not since the drought took Kansas and took Rachel with it, not since he'd learned that some silences never do get filled no matter how long a man waits, so he followed it. The print led up the slope behind the cabin, through scrub brush that clawed at his sleeves over a rise he hadn't climbed the day before, and on the far side of that rise, tucked into a fold of land, the ridge hid clean from view, he found smoke. Thin, gray, rising straight up in the windless pocket of the hollow. A cabin, smaller than his own, but sound. Roof whole, walls chinked tight against the weather. Firewood stacked in a way that spoke of a hand that took its time, that measured each log before it was set, and beside the door a garden, not but green, beans climbing a trellis of lashed branches, squash vines fat with fruit, green, in a valley where nothing was supposed to grow. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing and stared at that garden like it was a mirage, because it shouldn't exist. Not here. Not in ground this dry, this cursed, this dead, unless somebody was carrying water to it. Every day, by hand, which meant some Duddy had found water, where the whole of Coldwater Flat swore there wasn't any, which meant the well wasn't the only story this valley was keeping. He took a step toward the garden to look closer. The door of the cabin opened, and Elias Barrow, who had ridden through cannon smoke without his hands shaking, who had buried his wife with dry eyes because there hadn't been anything left inside him to cry with, felt his whole body go still, because the woman filling that doorway was not a woman shaped like other women. She had to duck to clear the frame, had to turn her shoulders sideways to fit through it at all, and even hunched, even folded down to make herself small enough for a door built for someone else's world. She still stood taller than any man he'd ever stood beside. Her shoulders were wide as a door themselves. Her hands, hanging loose at her sides, looked like they could close around a fence post and snap it like kindling. Her eyes found him instantly, pale, steady, not startled, not even surprised. Like she'd known he was coming before he knew it himself. You're on my land. Her voice was low, even. It didn't rise the way a frightened voice rises, and it didn't shout the way an angry one does. It simply was the way weather simply is, and there was no arguing with weather. Paper says it's mine. Elias kept his hands loose at his sides. Empty. Visible. Bought it yesterday. In town. Paper. She said the word like it tasted bad. Paper doesn't know this ground. Paper never dug it. Never bled on it. Never buried anybody in it. Neither have I yet. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything Elias could name. Give it time. She stepped fully out of the doorway then, unfolding to her full height in the open air, and Elias understood, really understood, in his chest, in the base of his spine, why grown men in Coldwater Flat went quiet when they talked about the shape on the ridge. Because she wasn't a story. She wasn't a rumor whittled bigger. With every retelling over whiskey, she was real. 7 feet of real, standing in front of him with dirt on her hands and a garden growing green behind her in a valley that had no business growing anything at all. Elias Barrow. He said it plain. No hand extended. He understood, somehow, that this wasn't a moment for handshakes. Bought the hollow place off a man in town who couldn't stop grinning while he took my money. Odessa. She offered nothing else. No last name. Like a last name was a door she'd decided to keep shut. And you bought a grave, Mr. Barrow. You just don't know it yet. Then tell me. No. That single word landed harder than any of the rest. Flat final. A door closing. You came up that ridge to ask me questions. She tilted her head, studying him the way a person studies weather rolling and trying to guess how bad it's going to be before it arrives. You should have stayed at your own fire. Somebody stood outside my fire all night. Elias held her gaze. Didn't blink. Left a print in the dirt twice the size of mine. Didn't say a word. Just silence. The wind moved through the beans on the trellis. A soft rattling sound. The only thing that dared to make noise between them. You should be more afraid than you are, Odessa said finally. I buried a wife 2 winters back. His voice didn't shake. Hadn't shaken in a long while. Buried a herd before her. Buried a piece of Kansas dirt I thought I'd die on. There isn't much left to me being afraid of a woman standing in a garden. Something crossed her face then, quick. Gone before he could name it. Then you're either the bravest fool who ever bought this land. She turned back toward her door. Or the last one who'll live long enough to regret it. Wait. She stopped. Didn't turn around. Just stood there back to him. Shoulders squared like she was bracing for a blow that hadn't come yet. Why do you guard it? Elias asked. The land. The well. Whatever it is you're up here keeping watch over. Why? For a long moment she said nothing. The wind kept moving through the beans. Somewhere far off, a hawk called once and went quiet. Because the well down there didn't just go dry, she said, at last, still not turning. It died. And men killed it. And I am done watching men finish what they started. Then she went inside, and the door shut behind her, soft final, and Elias Barrow stood alone in a green garden in the middle of a dead valley, with more questions in his chest than he'd carried in 3 long years. He walked back down the ridge slower than he'd climbed it, because her words wouldn't sit still in him. Men killed it. Not the drought. Not God. Not bad luck riding through on a dry wind. She'd said it like a fact, not a grievance. Like something she'd watched happen with her own eyes, and had been waiting 6 years for somebody to ask her about. Which meant somebody should ask her about it. Which meant, whether he liked it or not, Elias Barrow was staying. He told himself it was about the land. Told himself a man who'd already lost everything once wasn't about to walk away from 600 acres over a woman with a temper and a garden. Told himself that 3 times on the walk back down, and believed it for about as long as it took him to reach his own broken door. Then he stood in the ruin of his cabin and admitted the truth to nobody but the dark. He wasn't staying for the land. He was staying because for the first time in 3 years, something in this God-forsaken valley had looked at him and not looked away first. Morning came gray and hard-edged, the kind of light that didn't forgive anything it touched. Elias walked to the well before he'd even built a fire for coffee. Stood at the stone lip the way he had the day before. Except this time he didn't just look. He got down on his knees in the dust and looked closer. At the ring of stones. At the way some of them, low down near the base, were darker than the rest. Not water dark. Not the clean gray-black of stone that had spent years wet and cool. This was a different dark. Stained. Old. He reached down and brushed at the dirt collected in a crack between 2 stones. His fingers found something that wasn't dirt. Cloth. Rotted, sun-bleached. Buried so long it had nearly turned to dust itself. But cloth all the same, and, wound into it, he pulled gently, and the ground gave up its secret in pieces, small bones, too small for a man, Too many, clustered together. The kind of scatter that happens when something is thrown down rather than laid to rest. An animal, maybe. A dog. A calf. Even. Small enough, except the cloth was wrong for that. Cloth didn't wrap around a dead calf by accident. And beneath the bones, half buried, dark with age but unmistakable, once his fingers found the shape of it, a jar. Cracked. Empty now, whatever had been inside it long since gone to ground. But the smell that came up when he lifted it out of the dirt made his stomach turn even 11 years too late. Bitter. Chemical. Wrong. He sat back on his heels in the dust and stared at what he was holding, because a well didn't just go dry on its own and grow this. A well didn't bury cloth and bone and a poison jar in its own throat. By accident, somebody had done this. Somebody had knelt right where he was kneeling, years back, and poured something into this ground meant to kill it. Meant to kill it on purpose. Meant to make sure it stayed dead, not a curse. Not God's judgment on cursed ground, a crime. He knelt there a long while with the jar in his hands, the wind picking at his collar, and somewhere behind him, up on the ridge, he had the sudden certain feeling that he was being watched again. He turned. Nothing. Just scrub brush and empty slope and the ridgeline cutting hard against a colorless sky. But she knew. He was sure of it now. Sure the way a man is only sure of a handful of things in his life. Odessa Ashworth had been standing over this well before he ever rode into the valley, and she had not been standing there out of fear of a ghost. She'd been standing guard over a murder scene. He climbed the ridge with the jar still in his hand. Found her in the garden again, kneeling between the bean rows, her back to him, and this time he didn't wait to be noticed. He walked right up to the edge of her garden and held the jar out where she couldn't pretend not to see it. You knew. Odessa didn't turn around right away. Her hands kept working the soil, slow, deliberate, like his voice hadn't reached her at all. You knew this whole time. His voice rose despite himself. 6 years you've been standing on that ridge letting the whole town call you a monster. And the whole time you knew the well didn't die on its own. She stood then, unfolded slow, dirt on her palms, and turned to face him with an expression that gave nothing away. What did you find? Bones. Cloth. A jar that still smells like poison after 11 years in the ground. He held it up higher, like the evidence could make her flinch. It didn't. Somebody killed this well on purpose, Odessa, and you've known it the whole time. Yes. Just that, one word. No apology behind it. No explanation offered up free of charge. Then tell me who. No. Why not? Because you'll go into town swinging that jar around like a preacher with a Bible and you'll get yourself killed before sundown. And then I'll be burying you too. Her voice cracked just slightly, just for a heartbeat, before she caught it and flattened it back down. I am tired of burying people who came here trying to help. That stopped him. Who else? She didn't answer. Odessa. Who else? That is not your well to ask about. She turned back to her garden, kneeling again, hands returning to the dirt like the conversation was already finished. It is not your ground, not your grief. You bought paper. You did not buy the right to my dead. I bought 600 acres with a murder buried in the middle of it. Elias set the jar down carefully in the dirt between them, like laying down a weapon in a truce he hadn't been offered. That makes it my business whether you like it or not. She looked up at him then, and for the first time since he'd ridden into the valley, something other than warning moved behind her eyes. Something tired. Something old. You don't understand what you're standing in the middle of. Then explain it. I don't owe you that. No, he agreed, you don't. But I'm not leaving, not the ranch. Not this ridge. Not until I understand why a well got murdered and a woman's been standing guard over the grave for 6 years. Alone, letting people call her a monster rather than tell them the truth. Odessa rose to her full height again, slow, and for a moment the space between them felt very small despite how much of it there actually was. You bought dead ground, Mr. Barrow. Her voice had gone quiet, quieter than he'd heard it yet, which means, whether you understand it or not, you belong to it now. And it does not let go easy. Neither do I. She said it like a warning, like a door closing softly instead of slamming. But something in the way she said it belonged landed differently than a warning should, and Elias felt it settle in his chest and stay there. Then I suppose we're stuck with each other. The faintest line appeared at the corner of her mouth, gone almost before it arrived. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Elias marked it, filed it away, the first crack in 6 years of stone. I suppose we are, Odessa said. For now. They did not become friends that week. Elias understood that plainly enough not to expect it, What they became instead was two people circling the same fire from opposite sides, each one waiting to see if the other would step closer or step back. Odessa came down from the ridge most mornings now, though she never announced it, never knocked, never did anything so ordinary as say good morning. She simply appeared at the edge of the yard, at the broken fence line, once standing so still beside the barn that Elias walked right past her before his mind caught up to what his eyes had already seen, and he near jumped clean out of his boots. You have got to stop doing that. Doing what? Standing there like a tree that grew overnight. The corner of her mouth did that thing again. That almost smile that vanished before it could be called one. I was here first. You were not standing in my barn first. Wasn't your barn first either? She nodded at the sagging roofline. The timber gone soft with rot along one whole wall. Was nobody's barn for 11 years. Then it was mine, because I was the only one fool enough to keep it from falling down. Elias looked at the barn with new eyes. Then, at the patched section along the north wall, boards clearly newer than the rest, fitted with the care no drifting stranger would have bothered with. You've been keeping this place standing. Somebody had to. Why? She didn't answer right away. Turned instead and looked out over the cracked yard, the broken fence, the whole sorry stretch of ground that used to be somebody's living and had become, instead, a story men told over whiskey to scare each other. Because ruin spreads, she said finally. Let one thing fall down, the next thing falls easier, and the next. I have watched enough things fall down in my life, Mr. Barrow. I decided a long while back I was done watching. He didn't push further. Some doors he was learning opened wider if you didn't lean on them. They fell into a rhythm, neither one of them named out loud. Mornings, Elias worked the fence line, resetting posts, splicing wire, his hands remembering a labor they hadn't done in 3 years, and welcoming it back like an old ache finally being stretched. Afternoons, more often than not, Odessa would appear somewhere nearby, never close enough to call it company, never far enough to call it solitude, and simply work alongside him in a silence that stopped feeling uncomfortable somewhere around the third day. She could lift a fence post out of the ground, with one hand that would have taken him and a mule working together. She never made a show of it, never once looked to see if he was watching, the way some men might have, needing to be admired for their strength. She just did the work, the way weather does its work, without asking permission or expecting thanks. You're staring, she said, on the fourth day, not looking up from the post she was setting. I am not. You are. I can feel it. Same way I can feel a storm coming before the clouds show up. Elias felt heat climb up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the sun. I was admiring the fence post. The fence post, it's a fine fence post. Odessa turned to look at him then, one eyebrow raised so high it nearly vanished under the brim of her hat, and something in her face, some old, tired guard she'd been keeping up since long before he arrived, slipped, just for a second, into something that looked almost like amusement. You are a poor liar. Elias Barrow. I've been told. By who? My wife. The word landed between them, and sat there, heavier than he'd meant it to. He hadn't planned to say it. Hadn't planned to let Rachel's name find its way out of his mouth in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, over an ordinary fence post, in front of a woman he'd known 4 days. Odessa didn't flinch from it, didn't rush to fill silence with comfort she didn't owe him. Was, he corrected quietly. She was my wife. Kansas. Drought took the herd first. Took her the winter after. Fever, the doctor said, though I've always thought it was just everything. All of it, too much. Loss, not enough left in her to fight the last one off. I'm sorry. You don't have to say that. I know. Odessa went back to the post, driving it deeper, with a single, controlled swing of the mallet that would have taken him 3. I'm saying it anyway, because it's true, not because I owe it to you. Elias watched her work a moment longer. What about you, he said. Who taught you to build a fence like that? Something in her shoulders changed. Just slightly. A tightening quickly smoothed back over. A man who isn't here to ask. Where'd he go? Ground, she said it plain. No drama in it. The way a person says a fact. They've had a long time to make peace with. Same as most everybody I've loved. This valley collects things, Mr. Barrow. You'd do well to remember that before you get too comfortable staying. She didn't say anything else the rest of the afternoon. But she didn't leave either. And when the sun went down and Elias built his small, low fire the way he always did, he found for the first time since he'd ridden into Widow's Basin that he wasn't building it alone. Odessa sat across from it, a good 6 feet back, arms folded. watching the flames instead of him. But she stayed. He rode into Coldwater Flat 3 days later. For supplies he could no longer put off buying nails, flour, a length of good rope, the small necessary things a broken ranch demanded before it would agree to become a whole one again. The town greeted him differently than it had the first time. Not warmly. Coldwater Flat didn't strike Elias as a place that did warmly. Not for strangers. Not for anyone who hadn't been born and buried 3 generations deep in its dirt. But there was a shift, all the same. Fewer grins. More long looks that slid away the second he caught them. "You're still up there, then." The clerk at the land office said it without looking up from his ledger, same as before, except the mockery had drained clean out of his voice and left something flatter behind. Something almost like respect, though it clearly cost him to feel it. "I am. Word is you've been seen." Working alongside her. Word travels fast for a town this small. Word travels fast for a town this scared. The clerk finally looked up, and there was something careful in his face now. Something weighing whether to say the next part at all. "There's a man been through here. Twice now this month. Asking questions about the hollow place. About water rights. About how much a man might pay to buy out a neighbor who wasn't inclined to sell." Elias went, "Still, what man?" "Speculator. Calls himself. Name of Holt. Bardwell Holt." The clerk said it careful, like the name itself might be listening. "Money enough to make most folks forget their manners. He's been asking after the well, too. Real particular about it. Like he already knows something the rest of us don't." The name meant nothing to Elias. Not yet. It sat in him the way an unfamiliar word sits in a sentence noticed, but not yet understood. "Tell him if he comes asking again," Elias said. "The hollow's not for sale. I'd tell him myself. Except men like that don't much care what a land clerk has to say." The clerk went back to his ledger, but his voice dropped lower, almost a warning offered free of charge. "You watch yourself up there, Mr. Barrow. Whatever's buried under that ranch of yours. I get the feeling there's men in this territory who'd rather it stayed buried." He rode home slower than he'd ridden in, the name turning over and over in his mind the whole way. Bardwell Holt. Bardwell Holt. It meant nothing. It should have meant nothing. Except something in the shape of it, the sound of it, kept snagging on the edge of a memory he couldn't quite reach. Like a name he'd heard once, a long time back, half buried under 20 years of other, louder grief. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself a lot of men were named Holt, same as a lot of men were named Barrow, and there was no reason on God's earth for one land speculator's name to matter to him any more than the wind did. He believed it right up until he got home and went looking through the old crates stacked in the back corner of the barn, crates the previous owner had left behind, along with everything else, when he'd fled the hollow 11 years back rather than fight for it. The crates were mostly nothing. Rusted tools, a cracked lantern, papers so water-stained they'd fused into a single gray brick that crumbled at the corners when he touched it. But at the bottom of the last crate, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp out where nothing else had, Elias found a tin box. Small, dented, a latch that had rusted shut until he worked it loose with the edge of his knife, and the lid finally gave with a groan like something waking up after a long sleep. Inside, a stack of old letters, brittle and yellowed. A deed, folded so many times the creases had worn through in places. And beneath both, a strip of leather with a name burned into it, the kind a man might once have worn on his gun belt or nailed above his door. Elias unfolded the deed first. His eyes fast down the page, skimming past legal language he only half understood, until they caught on a signature at the bottom. A name written in a hand that pressed hard enough to nearly tear the paper. Josiah Holt. His whole body went cold, because he knew that name. Not Bardwell Josiah. He knew it the way a man knows a scar he hasn't looked at in years but can still feel every time the weather turns. He'd heard it screamed once, in a kitchen in eastern Kansas, 20 years back, from his father's mouth, the night the bank papers came, and the ranch his father had spent 30 years building went to a man who'd loaned it to him at a rate designed to fail, who'd wanted the land more than he'd ever wanted the debt repaid. Josiah Holt. The man who'd smiled while he ruined them. The man his father had cursed with his last clear breath before the grief and the drink took the rest of him, slow, over years, until there was nothing left of Elias's father to bury but a shell that used to hold a person. Elias sat down hard on the dirt floor of the barn, the deed shaking in his hands. 'Cause it couldn't be coincidence. It couldn't. Josiah Holt's name on a deed buried in a crate in a barn. 1,100 miles from where Elias had watched his father's world collapse, which meant this land, this specific cursed, poisoned stretch of ground, had crossed paths with the same family that had crossed paths with his own, once 20 years and 1,000 miles ago, which meant Bardwell Holt, asking after the well in town this very week, wasn't some stranger circling a piece of cheap land. He was blood, Josiah's blood, which made this, whatever this was, not a coincidence at all. Elias sat in the dust with the letters spread around him, reading by the fading light through the barn's broken slats, piecing together a story the paper only half told. Josiah Holt had owned water rights across half this territory once, had ruined more than one family doing it, had died. The last letter was dated 11 years back, the same year the well went dry, leaving everything, presumably, to a son who was now walking into Coldwater Flat asking careful questions about a place he already seemed to know far too much about. Until this moment, Elias had told himself he was staying for the land, for the fresh start, for the woman on the ridge who hadn't looked away from him. Now he understood he was staying for something else too, something older, something that had been waiting 20 years to find him, the same way it had apparently found this dying well, long before he ever rode into the valley. He folded the deed carefully, put it back in the tin, and sat there a long while in the dark, the barn creaking around him, until he heard footsteps outside, even, heavy, familiar now in a way they hadn't been a week ago. Odessa found him in the doorway a minute later, tin box in his hands, his face carved from something harder than it had been that morning. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost." Worse, he held the tin out, though he doubted she could read the deed in the dark, doubted that was even the point of offering it. "I've seen a name." She went very still. "What name?" "Holt." He watched her face carefully, watched something move behind her eyes that told him, plain as any confession, that the name meant something to her too. Josiah Holt, and a man named Bardwell, who's been asking careful questions about this well down in Coldwater Flat all week. For a long moment, Odessa said nothing at all. The wind moved through the broken barn slats, carrying dust and the smell of dry grass, and somewhere out past the ridge, a coyote called once into the coming dark. "That name," she said finally, quiet, careful, like each word cost her something to spend, "is the reason this well is dead, and the reason I have spent 6 years making sure nobody with that name ever gets close enough to finish what he started." Elias felt something settle in his chest. Cold and certain, the way decisions feel once a man stops arguing with himself about making them. "Then it seems," he said, "we've got more in common than a fence line." Odessa looked at him a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "It seems we do," she said. "God help us both." That night's sleep didn't come easy. When it finally did, it brought the past with it, the way it always had since Kansas, except this time it reached back further than Rachel, further than the herd, all the way back to a kitchen table in a house that didn't exist anymore, in a state he hadn't set foot in for 20 years. His father at that table, papers spread in front of him, the ink still fresh, a banker's careful signature at the bottom of every page. Elias, 15 years old, standing in the doorway, not yet understanding what he was watching, only understanding that his father's hands were shaking, and his father's hands never shook. "15 years I built this." His father's voice, low and broken in a way that scared Elias more than shouting ever could have. 15 years, and that man smiled the whole time he signed it away. "What man, Papa?" His father hadn't answered, had only stared at the papers, like they might rearrange themselves into a different story if he looked hard enough. And it was Elias's mother, standing behind her husband's chair with a hand on his shoulder, who'd finally said the name out loud, quiet, like speaking it too loud might summon the man himself. Josiah Holt. Elias hadn't understood, at 15, what that name would come to mean. Hadn't understood that it would sit in him for 20 years, waiting, hadn't understood, watching his father drink himself smaller and smaller across the following decade until there was nothing left of the man who used to lift him onto a saddle with one arm, that the ruin of that night would still be reaching forward, all these years later, into a dying well in a valley he'd never once heard of as a boy. He woke before dawn with his jaw aches from clenching it in his sleep, and the tin box sitting beside his bedroll, where he'd fallen asleep with his hand still resting on the lid. He found Odessa at the well that morning, kneeling at its edge the way he'd knelt there himself days before, one enormous hand resting flat against the stone like she was checking a pulse. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "Not a question. I don't sleep much." She didn't look up. "Haven't in a long while." He lowered himself down beside her, close enough now that a week ago he wouldn't have dared it, and neither one of them moved away. Tell me about him. He kept his voice gentle. The man who's not here to ask about the fence. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. The wind picked at the dry grass around them, and somewhere a meadowlark started up its morning song, absurdly cheerful against the weight sitting between them. His name was Otis. She said it slow, like the name still cost her something after all this time. Otis Renner, old ditch digger, come out here before I was born. Married the water same as some men marry a woman. Knew where every hidden spring in 3 counties ran before most folks even knew to look. How'd you come to know him? Odessa's jaw tightened. My family didn't want a daughter built like a barn door. She said it flat, no self-pity in it. Just fact laid bare the way she laid most things bare. By 14, I was taller than my own father. By 16, taller than every man in the county. They said I was a curse on the house. Said no decent man would ever want a wife who could sling a hay bale one-handed and look him level in the eye doing it. So they sent you away. They didn't have to send me. I left. Something flickered across her face, old and sharp even after all these years. Walked out one morning with nothing but the clothes on my back, and Otis found me half-starved on the Coldwater Road 3 days later. Didn't ask why a girl my size was crying in a ditch. Just handed me a canteen and said, "You look like somebody who could use a well that isn't cursed." Despite everything, Elias felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Sounds like a decent sort of man. He was the only decent sort of man I ever knew, till she stopped herself. Sharp. Like she'd nearly said something she hadn't meant to say yet. Till what? Till nothing. She stood abruptly, brushing dirt from her knees, taller against the pale morning sky than any shape had a right to be. He taught me to listen to ground the way other folks listen to a conversation. Taught me a dying well still has a voice, if you're patient enough to hear it. And when he died, her voice caught, just slightly quickly smoothed back over the way she smoothed over everything. I stayed. Because somebody had to keep listening, and there wasn't anybody else left who knew how. Elias stood too, close enough now that he had to tip his head back to hold her eyes. I'm glad he found you in that ditch. Careful, Mr. Barrow. Something warm flickered at the corner of her mouth. Quicker this time. Keep talking soft like that, and folks in town will start saying worse things about you than they already do. Let them talk. They will. They always do. She turned back toward the well, resting her hand on the stone again. This valley's better at talking than it is at digging. Otis used to say that. Said most men would rather stand around a dead well arguing about whose fault it was than pick up a shovel and go looking for water underneath the blame. And you? What do you say? Odessa looked at him then, something steady and searching in her pale eyes, like she was deciding how much more of herself she was willing to hand a man she'd known less than 2 weeks. I say pick up the shovel, she said finally. Grief doesn't fill a well. Work does. The storm came up fast 3 days later, the way storms did in the basin, no warning, no long gray buildup, just a wall of black cloud rolling over the ridge like something had knocked it loose from the sky and let it fall. Elias was out at the fence line when the wind hit. First a gust that near took his hat clean off. Then a wall of it, cold and sudden, dragging dust and brush sideways across the yard hard enough to sting. Get to the barn. Odessa's voice cut through the wind from somewhere behind him. Already moving, already faster than a person her size had any right to be. He ran for it, almost made it too. Except the old dead cottonwood at the corner of the yard, the one he'd told himself for 2 weeks he really ought to cut down, the one he'd kept putting off because there was always some fence post more urgent, chose that exact moment to give up its long, slow argument with gravity. Elias heard the crack before he understood what it meant. Heard it, and turned, and saw the whole rotten trunk of it coming down across the yard, right where his own feet were about to carry him. He didn't move fast enough. What happened next happened in pieces, the way disaster always does, too fast to follow whole, only fast enough to feel each piece land separate and hard. A weight slamming into his side, the ground rushing up, the tree coming down not on him, but beside him, close enough that a branch caught his shoulder and tore his sleeve and left a line of fire down his arm, but not close enough to crush him, because someone had thrown him clear of it, with a force that knocked the breath clean out of his chest. He lay stunned in the dirt a moment, rain starting to needle down now, and looked up to find Odessa above him, one arm still extended from where she'd shoved him, her whole body between him and the fallen tree. Are you hurt? Not a question. A demand. I don't. He tried to sit up, felt the fire in his shoulder, hissed through his teeth. Shoulder, might be. Nothing broken, I think. Let me see. Odessa, I'm fine. Let me see. Her hands were already at his shoulder, careful despite their size. Careful in a way that made his breath catch, for a different reason entirely. Probing along the torn sleeve with a gentleness that didn't match the strength he'd just watched her use to knock a grown man 10 feet through the air. Bruised, cut, not deep. You'll live, Mr. Barrow. Though you came closer to not living than I'd like. Rain fell harder now, soaking them both, and neither one moved to get up right away. She was still half over him, one hand braced in the mud beside his head, and up close. This close, he could see things he hadn't let himself notice before. The pale scar through one eyebrow. The way her breathing hadn't quite settled yet either. You could have been crushed yourself, he said, throwing me like that. I wasn't going to let this valley bury another man on my watch. Her voice had gone rough, stripped of its usual flatness. I've buried enough. I am done. Do you understand me? I am done. Odessa, don't. She pulled back, sudden, like she'd caught herself somewhere she hadn't meant to go, and stood, offering him a hand up, that he took because his shoulder made standing on his own a slow and undignified business. Don't say anything else right now. Just get up. Get inside before this storm decides to try again. He let her pull him to his feet, and for one suspended second, standing chest to sternum with a woman who could have snapped him in half, and had instead just thrown herself between him and a falling tree, Elias Barrow felt something shift in his chest that had been frozen solid since a Kansas winter 2 years back. Thank you, he said quiet, under the rain. Odessa didn't answer right away. Just looked at him a long moment, rain running down a face that had gone soft in a way he hadn't seen it go soft before. Get inside, Elias. She said his given name for the first time since he'd arrived, and it landed different than Mr. Barrow ever had. Before I have to save you twice in one afternoon. They waited out the worst of the storm in his cabin, since it sat closer than the climb back up to her place, and for the first time Odessa Ashworth ducked through Elias Barrow's door and stood carefully, folded down, one hand braced against the low rafter inside 4 walls that belonged to him. He built up the fire while she wrung rain from her sleeves, and for a while neither one said much of anything. Just let the storm do the talking outside, thunder rolling long and low across the basin, rain hammering the roof he still hadn't finished patching. This is a poor excuse for a cabin, Odessa said finally, eyeing the gap in the roof where a steady drip had started collecting in an old tin cup he'd set out days ago and forgotten about. It's a work in progress. It's been a work in progress for 2 weeks. Some of us, Elias, easing himself down by the fire, favoring his bruised shoulder, have been distracted lately, fending off falling trees and the like. That earned him something close to a real laugh. Short, surprised out of her, like she hadn't planned on letting it loose and couldn't quite call it back once it started. Fair enough, Mr. Barrow. Elias. She looked at him a moment. Elias, she said, testing the shape of it, and something about the way she said it made the fire feel warmer than it had any right to. You know, he said, watching the flames, back in Kansas, before everything, I used to think a man's whole life could get planned out in advance if he just worked hard enough at it. Land, herd, family, all of it laid out neat as a fence line. And now? Now I've learned the land doesn't care much for a man's plans. He glanced at her. Neither does the weather. Neither, it turns out, does a 7-foot woman who throws grown men out of the path of falling trees. I am not 7 feet. Close enough that I'm not arguing the point. She almost smiled again. This time it stayed a beat longer before it faded. Land doesn't punish, plan. She quiet now, watching the fire instead of him. That was one of Otis's. Said it only punishes the folks who stop listening to it. Stop paying attention. Tomorrow, forget to notice what the ground's trying to tell them today. Smart man. He was. A pause, waited. I miss him every day. Still. 6 years on, and some mornings it still catches me sideways, like the missing hasn't worn down at all. Just learn to hide better. I know that feeling. I know you do. She looked at him then, steady, something soft moving behind the usual guarded stillness of her eyes. It's why I let you stay, that first day. Not because of any paper you signed. Because a man who's buried what you've buried and still rides toward trouble instead of away from it, that's not a fool, Elias Barrow. That's a man who's already survived the worst thing that can happen to him, and isn't afraid of much after that. The fire popped. Rain kept coming down outside, softer now, the storm beginning to spend itself. I wasn't planning on staying, he admitted. Not really. Not past fixing the fence and figuring out if the well could be saved. But, but I don't much want to leave anymore. Odessa didn't answer right away. Just sat with that a while, the firelight moving across her face. And when she finally spoke, her voice had gone quieter than he'd heard it yet. Good, she said simply, because I don't much want you to. Morning broke clean and washed, the way it does after a hard storm, the whole valley smelling briefly, impossible, of wet earth instead of dust. They surveyed the damage together. The cottonwood down across the yard, already half sawn through by the time the sun cleared the ridge, because Odessa had started on it before Elias even woke, her axe strokes steady and unhurried, biting deep with every swing. A section of fence flattened. The barn roof holding, barely, thanks to the patch Odessa had insisted on reinforcing 3 days back, muttering something about men who put off necessary work until the sky decided to teach them a lesson. We should start on the well properly, Elias said, watching her split the fallen trunk into sections with an ease that still, after 2 weeks, managed to surprise him. Not just guard it, dig it, clear it, see what's actually still alive down there under everything that man poisoned. Odessa paused, axe resting against her shoulder, and studied him a long moment. That's slow work, dangerous work, done wrong. Collapse a wall of that shaft on yourself, and there won't be any throwing you clear of it. I know, you'd need somebody who knows how to listen to ground properly. Somebody who knows where the water still runs, under all that poison, without digging blind and killing what's left of it. I know that too. He held her gaze, which is why I'm asking you. Not to guard it anymore, Odessa. To help me bring it back. The offer sat between them a long moment, weighted with everything. Neither one of them had said outright yet that this wasn't really about a well at all anymore. Not entirely. Not for either of them. You understand what you're asking. Her voice had gone careful. Bring that well back to life, and Bardwell Holt is going to hear about it inside a week. A man like that doesn't come sniffing around dead land for the fun of it. He wants something buried under it, same as his father did. Wake the well, and you wake his interest along with it. Let him come. You say that now. I mean it now. Elias felt something harden in his chest. The same cold certainty that had settled there the night he'd found the deed in the barn. My father spent 15 years building something, and one Holt tore it down in an afternoon, with a signature and a smile. I am not about to let his son do the same thing twice in one family, 20 years apart, on 2 different pieces of ground. Odessa studied him a long moment, rain-washed morning light catching the set of her jaw, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite trust, not yet, but the early shape of it, the foundation a person lays before they're willing to build anything more on top of it. Then we'd best get started, she said. Before he does. They began that very afternoon, clearing brush from around the well's stone lip, marking out where Odessa said the old channel used to run before it had been fouled, and buried a shallow scar in the land, visible now that she pointed it out, that Elias would have walked past 100 times without ever seeing. There, she said, kneeling, pressing her palm flat against the cracked earth a good 30 yards from the well itself. Feel that. Elias knelt beside her, pressed his own hand down beside hers. I don't feel anything. You will, give it time. Otis used to say most men expect the ground to shout at them and get frustrated when it only ever whispers. She closed her eyes, still as stone herself, and after a long moment, something in her face changed. There, cool. You feel that? Just a breath of it. Water, moving slow, deep down, still alive under all this dead ground on top. Elias closed his eyes too, concentrated. And after a long, patient moment, he felt it, or told himself he did. A faint coolness rising up through the cracked earth into his palm, so slight he might have imagined it. I feel something. That's a start. Odessa opened her eyes, looked at him with something almost like approval. The land doesn't care how big or how small a man is, whether he's a giant or ordinary as fence posts. It only cares whether he's willing to listen. You're listening, Elias Barrow. I'm trying. That's all any of us can do. She stood, offering him a hand up, and this time he took it without hesitation, without the strange awkwardness of the first days, like it had simply become the natural order of things. Her hand, his, the ground beneath them both, and somewhere far below, water, waiting, patient, for somebody willing to dig deep enough and gentle enough to bring it back. An old man rode out from Coldwater Flat on 2 days after that, alone, leading a second horse loaded with sacks of nails and seed Elias hadn't ordered. Elias recognized him before he'd even swung down the whittler from the land office, the one who'd sat by the door that first day, missing 2 fingers, watching Elias sign away $11 with a curiosity that hadn't been unkind, not exactly, just cautious. Amos Dell. The old man offered a hand, calloused and missing those same 2 fingers Elias remembered, and this time there was nothing careful in the gesture at all. Figured you could use these before Winter thinks about showing up early. I didn't order supplies. Didn't say you did. Amos began unloading the second horse without waiting to be asked, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man who'd spent 60 years learning that most jobs went easier out with discussing them first. Just figured a man rebuilding a dead ranch might appreciate not having to ride into town for every last nail, especially with a certain gentleman in a fine coat stirring up trouble down there. Elias went still. You know Holt. Everybody in Coldwater Flat knows Holt, or knows enough to be careful around him. Amos set the last sack down, straightened, and looked past Elias toward the ridge, toward the cabin half hidden behind it, with none of the fear Elias had expected. Knew his father, too, once. Josiah Holt bought out my brother's spread on the north end of the basin, 30-some years back. Same trick every time, loan a man money he can't quite pay back on schedule he can't quite meet, then smile while the bank takes everything. Your brother lost the ranch, lost his nerve not long after, moved east last I heard, and never wrote again. Amos's jaw tightened, old grief surfacing plain on his weathered face. So when folks in town laugh about the curse on this place, about the monster on the ridge, I don't laugh along, Mr. Barrow. I know good and well what kind of monster really did the killing around here, and it wasn't the woman living up on that hill. Elias felt something shift in his chest, the first crack he'd seen yet in the town's easy mockery, the first sign that Coldwater Flat's silence hadn't been agreement so much as fear, worn so long it had calcified into something that looked like consensus. Does the rest of town know that? What you just told me? Some do. Most keep it quiet. Fear's got a way of doing that to people, makes silence feel safer than truth right up until it isn't anymore. Amos climbed back onto his horse, slow, joints protesting audibly. You keep it what you're doing out here, Mr. Barrow. Wake that well back up. There's more folks in Coldwater Flat rooting for you than you'd guess by the laughing. We're just waiting to see if you're fool enough, or brave enough, to actually manage it. He rode off without waiting for thanks, and Elias stood a long while in the yard afterward, watching the dust settle, understanding for the first time that the fight ahead of him wasn't only his and Otis's to carry. Somewhere down in that town, quiet and unspoken, a whole community was waiting to see which story finally won. The rider came up the trail 4 days later, in the flat gold light of early evening, and Elias knew who it was before the man ever spoke a word. Because nobody dressed like that rode into Widow's Basin by accident. Fine coat, dust-free, in a way that meant he'd changed it recently. Somewhere clean, somewhere far from the kind of work that actually built anything. A horse too well fed for a territory this hard. And a smile, Elias recognized it instantly, though he'd never seen this particular face before, because he'd heard that same smile described once, 20 years back, in his mother's shaking voice at a kitchen table in Kansas. Mr. Barrow, I take it. The rider didn't dismount. Just sat there, looking down at the half-repaired fence, the cleared brush around the well, the whole slow resurrection of a ranch. Everyone in Coldwater Flat had written off as dead. Bardwell Holt. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. We haven't. Elias didn't offer a hand. Didn't move from where he stood. And I can't say I was looking to remedy that. Holt's smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened, the way a man's smile widens when he's used to getting exactly what he wants, and hasn't yet learned what it feels like not to. I hear you've been busy. Holt's gaze drifted past him, toward the ridge, toward the cabin half hidden behind it, and something flickered behind his eyes that Elias liked even less than the smile. Fixing fences, clearing wells, keeping company with something the rest of this valley's had the good sense to leave alone. Her name is Odessa. Is it? Holt said it like the correction bored him. I'd be careful, Mr. Barrow, getting too attached to things that don't rightly belong to you. Land, water, company you keep. He finally swung down from his horse, unhurried, and Elias felt every muscle in his body go taut and ready without quite deciding to. This valley has a way of taking back what it's owed. My father learned that lesson the hard way, once, a long time ago, on a piece of ground not so different from this one. Your father, Elias said, slowly, ruined a man in Kansas 20 years back. Signed away everything he'd built with a smile just like yours. Something shifted behind Holt's easy expression. Just for a heartbeat. Gone. Before Elias could be certain he'd seen it at all. That's an old story, Mr. Barrow. It doesn't have much bearing on what happens here. It's got every bearing on it. Elias took a step closer, close enough now that Holt's easy smile finally faltered. Because I'm the boy who watched that ruin happen. And I am not about to stand by 20 years later and watch it happen twice. For a long moment, the two men stood in the gold evening light, the fence half-mended behind them, the well waiting patient, and cracked in the distance. And Bardwell Holt's smile slowly rebuilt itself into something colder than it had been before. That's a shame, he said finally, mounting back up with unhurried ease. Because this well is going to run again, one way or another, Mr. Barrow. My family spent 20 years making sure of it. I'd hate for you to be standing in the wrong place when it finally does. He turned his horse and rode back down the trail without another word, and Elias stood watching until the dust of him disappeared entirely behind the ridgeline. Odessa found him still standing at the fence line, as the last light drained out of the sky, the ridge gone violet then gray, then swallowed whole by the coming dark. I saw him ride up. She came to stand beside him, more close, now that her shoulder nearly brushed his, and neither one of them moved away from that closeness the way they might have 2 weeks back. I saw him right away, too. Whatever he said to you, it didn't sit easy. He knows who I am. Elias kept his eyes on the darkening trail, the last place Holt's dust had hung in the air before the wind carried it off. Knows what his father did to mine. And he doesn't care, not even a little. It's just business to him. Same as this well. Same as whatever's under it he wants so badly. It's never just business with that family. Odessa's voice had gone hard, old anger surfacing beneath the careful stillness she usually kept. Josiah Holt could ruin a man's whole life and sleep easy that same night, because to him, a ruined man was never a person, just an entry in a ledger, balanced and closed. And Bardwell? Cut from the same cloth. Worse, maybe. His father at least had the decency to do his ruining slow, over years with paper and patience. I don't think his son has that kind of patience left in him. She looked over at Elias, something fierce and protective moving behind her pale eyes. Which means we don't have much time to waste being careful, either of us. Elias turned to face her, fully then, the last of the light catching the strong lines of her face, the scar through her eyebrow, the steady weight of her gaze that had unsettled him so badly the first day and now somehow felt like the only solid ground left in a valley full of quicksand. 2 weeks ago, he said, I rode in here with nothing left to lose. Buried my wife. Buried my herd. Bought a piece of dead ground for $11 because I didn't much care anymore whether I lived or died trying to make something of it. And now? Now I've got a well worth saving. A fence worth mending. He held her gaze, steady, sure, and a woman standing beside me who threw herself into the path of a falling tree rather than let this valley bury one more thing she cared about. Odessa didn't look away. Didn't retreat behind the old careful stillness the way she might have that first day. I told you once, she said quietly, that buying this ground meant you belonged to it now, that it wouldn't let go easy. Neither would I remember. I meant it as a warning that day. Her voice had softened, though her eyes stayed steady, fierce, unflinching. I'm not sure I mean it as one anymore. The wind moved soft between them, carrying the smell of wet earth and turned soil and faint but unmistakable now. The first cool breath of water rising up from a well that had been dead for 11 years and was, slowly, patiently, starting to remember how to live again. Then I suppose, Elias said, we'd best get to work proving Bardwell Holt wrong about which one of us this valley intends to bury next. Odessa's mouth curved, slow and certain, into the first full smile he'd seen cross her face since the day he rode in. I suppose we had, she said. Elias Barrow, welcome to Briar Hollow. Above them, the first stars broke through the last gray light, hard and cold and steady over a valley that had spent 11 years learning how to die, and was only now, cautiously, beginning to remember what it felt like to hope for something else instead. The digging started at dawn and did not stop until the light gave out. Day after day, blister after blister, Elias's hands, soft once from a life he barely recognized anymore, hardened back into the calluses they'd worn during the war, then during Kansas, then here, all over again. Like his body remembered how to survive, even when his heart had forgotten how. Odessa worked beside him, without complaint, without rest, most days, until he made her take it, Because even a woman built like a mountain needed to sleep sometime, and he'd learned by the second week that she'd work herself into the ground, rather than admit she was tired. "You're doing it again." He said it on the ninth morning, watching her haul a boulder out of the widening shaft with both arms, sweat cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. "Doing what?" "Working like something's chasing you." "Something is." She didn't stop. Didn't even slow. Winter. Bardwell Holt. "Every hour we don't spend digging is an hour he spends figuring out how to take this land back some other way. I don't sleep well knowing that. You don't sleep well." That earned him a look, sharp, almost amused despite itself. "Careful, Mr. Barrow." "Elias." "Careful, Elias." Something warm crossed her face, quicker now, more familiar than it had been 2 weeks back, like a door that had learned to swing a little easier on its hinges. "Or I'll start finding excuses to work you twice as hard, just to even the score." "You already do." "Then I suppose you'll just have to get used to it." He laughed. Actually laughed, the sound surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise her, because it had been a long, long while since something had pulled a laugh out of him that easy, that unplanned. They kept digging. The well gave up its secrets slow, the way anything worth having generally does. First, a dampness in the walls of the widening shaft, barely there, easy to miss unless a person pressed a bare palm flat against the stone and waited. Then, a week later, a darkness in the dirt at the bottom that wasn't dust anymore. Mud. Real mud, cool and rich, the first the ground had produced in 11 years. Then, on a gray morning that started like every other morning, water, not a flood, not a gush, just a slow, patient seep rising up through the bottom of the shaft, dark and clean, catching the weak morning light in a way that made Elias's chest go tight and strange. Odessa. His voice cracked on her name, Odessa. "Look." She came to the edge of the shaft and looked down, and for a long moment neither one of them said anything at all. Just watch water, actual water, after 11 years, after everything pools slow and quiet in the bottom of a hole that had been nothing but dust and bone and a dead man's poison for over a decade. "It's alive." Odessa's voice had gone rough. "The ground, it's alive again." Elias climbed down into the shaft, careful of the widening pool, and cupped both hands into it, brought them up dripping, looked at the water in his palms like it might disappear if he blinked too hard. "Is it safe to drink?" "Not yet. Not for a while." Odessa knelt at the shaft's edge, watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something unguarded, something close to wonder. "But it's running. Really running. A well that's been murdered takes longer to trust the living again than a well that just went dry natural. This one's had 11 years of reasons not to trust anybody. And now it's decided to trust us anyway." She reached down, and Elias reached up, and their hands met somewhere in the middle, water dripping between their fingers, and for a moment the whole valley seemed to go still around them, holding its breath the same way they were. They celebrated that night the only way two people worn thin by grief and work knew how to celebrate anything. Quietly. Odessa brought down a bottle from her cabin, something homemade and fierce that burned going down and warmed going further, and they sat by the fire, passing it back and forth like two soldiers sharing rations. And for a while neither one of them talked about Holt or dead wells or 20-year-old ruins at all. "Tell me something good," Elias said, watching the flames. "Something from before Otis, before any of this." Odessa considered it a long while, turning the bottle in her big hands. "There was a creek," she said finally, "near where I grew up. Before my family decided I was too big for the house to hold. I used to go there alone, because I was always alone by then, and I'd sit with my feet in the water and pretend the current could wash some of the size off me, make me smaller, make me fit. Did it work? No." A small, rueful laugh. "But the water didn't care how big I was. Didn't flinch away from me the way people did. Just kept moving, patient, over my feet, like I was any other rock in the stream. First time in my whole life I remember feeling ordinary." Elias watched her in the firelight, something tender rising in his chest that he didn't try to name yet. "You're not ordinary, Odessa. I know that night and now." She met his eyes, steady, unguarded in a way that undid something in him. "Took me a long while to stop hating it. Stop wishing I could shrink down small enough for the whole world to be comfortable around me. Otis was the one who finally talked me out of that. What'd he say? Said the world doesn't need more people trying to make themselves smaller, to fit rooms that were built too narrow in the first place." Her voice softened. "Said the rooms ought to be the ones that change." Elias sat with that a long moment, the fire popping between them, and found himself reaching, slow, uncertain, to rest his hand over hers where it lay on the ground between their two seats. She didn't pull away. "Your turn," she said, quiet. "Tell me something good." He thought of Rachel first. That was still where his mind went. Reflexive, 2 years of habit not yet worn smooth. But then, unbidden, another memory rose up instead. Older, warmer. "My father used to take me riding before dawn," he said slowly. "Before the ranch failed. Before any of it. Just the two of us out across land that was still ours. Still green. Watching the sun come up over ground he'd built with his own two hands. He'd always say the same thing. Every single morning." What'd he say? Said, "A man who watches the sun rise over his own land has already won more than most men ever will, whatever comes after." Elias's voice caught just slightly. "I hadn't thought about that in years. Not since before Holt took it all. Not since before I stopped believing land could belong to anybody. Not really, not for long. Do you believe it now?" He looked at her, then really looked. The firelight soft on her face, her hand still warm and steady under his, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he could remember. "I'm starting to," he said. Yes. They sat like that a long while, hands joined, fire burning low, and neither one of them moved to pull away. The water kept rising through the following week, and with it came something neither Elias nor Odessa had expected. It started with the Pruitt place, 3 miles east, a scrubby little spread that had been fighting its own dry well for going on 5 years. Old Man Pruitt rode up unannounced on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, an expression on his weathered face like a man who wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified. "My well came back." He said it before he'd even swung down from his horse, like he'd been holding the words in the whole ride over and couldn't keep them in any longer. 3 days back. Just started running again. Clear as anything. First time in 5 years. Elias exchanged a look with Odessa, something cold and careful passing between them. "How's that possible?" Elias said slowly. "With your place 3 miles off from ours." "That's exactly what I came to ask you." Pruitt's eyes darted toward the ridge, toward the well he couldn't see from here but clearly knew about. Same as everybody in Coldwater Flat knew about it by now. "Folks are saying you dug something loose up here. Something big." Odessa knelt down, pressed her palm flat to the ground the way she always did, closed her eyes, and went still for a long moment. "It's not just our well," she said, finally quiet, almost to herself. "Otis used to talk about this. A vein, running deep under half the basin, older than any of the ranches, sitting on top of it. Most folks dug their own separate wells over the years, never knowing they were all just drinking from different mouths of the same throat. Which means..." Elias felt the shape of it before she finished saying it out loud. "Which means whoever controls this well controls water for half the valley." Odessa stood, brushing dirt from her knees, her face gone hard and pale. "Every ranch downstream of here. Every family in Coldwater Flat that isn't drawing straight from the river. All of it running through this one throat, and we just opened it back up." Pruitt looked between them, understanding dawning slow and heavy on his face. "That's why Holt wants it. That's why Holt's father poisoned it in the first place." Odessa's voice had gone flat, cold, the voice of someone doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to 11 years ago. Wasn't about ruining one family's ranch. Was about controlling water rights for half of Widow's Basin. Quiet, patient, waiting for the right buyer to come dig it back open, so he could swoop in after and claim it belonged to him all along. "Except we're the ones who dug it open," Elias said slowly. "Not him, which makes us the ones standing between Bardwell Holt and half the water rights in this territory." Odessa met his eyes, something grim and steady, settling into her expression. "That's not a fence dispute anymore, Elias. That's a war he's not going to walk away from quiet." Pruitt cleared his throat, twisting his hat in his hands. "Whatever you two decide to do," he said, "you should know you've got more folks behind you than just me. Word spreading fast about wells coming back to life all up and down the basin. People are starting to remember who dug that poison into the ground in the first place. And they're starting to remember it wasn't the woman on the ridge." He rode off soon after, and Elias stood a long while at the fence, staring out over a valley that had suddenly gotten a great deal larger and a great deal more dangerous in the space of a single conversation. "This isn't just our fight anymore," he said finally. "No," Odessa agreed, quiet. "It never really was. We just didn't understand the size of it yet." 2 mornings later, Elias made the mistake of trying to cook breakfast. He'd never claimed to be much of a hand at it. Rachel had done the cooking back in Kansas, And since then he'd survived mostly on hardtack, dried beef, and a stubborn refusal to admit he needed help with something as simple as a skillet. But Odessa had been up since before dawn, hauling stone for the well's new retaining wall, and it seemed, he reasoned, like a fair trade to have something hot waiting when she came down. The bacon, unfortunately, had other plans. "Is something on fire?" Odessa asked, ducking through the cabin door, nose wrinkling at the smoke curling thick from the skillet. Elias. "It's supposed to do that." "It is not supposed to do that." She crossed the small room in 2 strides, lifted the skillet clean off the fire with her bare hand like it weighed nothing at all, and surveyed the charred, smoking ruin inside with an expression of profound, barely restrained amusement. This was bacon. It was going to be bacon. Elias Barrow. She set the skillet down, folding her arms, that most smile threatening to break into something fuller. "You survived a war. You rebuilt a fence line with your bare hands. You stood down 8 of Bardwell Holt's men without so much as flinching. And Bacon has defeated you. Bacon," he said solemnly, "is a formidable opponent." She laughed the real laugh, the one that still, weeks in, caught him by surprise every time he managed to pull it loose from her and reached past him to salvage what little breakfast remained. Her movements easy and practiced in a way his clearly were not. "Sit down," she said, "before you set the whole cabin ablaze trying to impress me. Is it working? The impressing?" "Spectacularly." She cracked eggs into the same skillet with brisk efficiency, not quite hiding her smile. "I'm positively swooning. You don't strike me as a swooning sort of woman. I'm making an exception." She glanced back at him, something warm and teasing in her pale eyes. "For a man brave enough to burn breakfast rather than admit he can't cook. In my defense." "There is no defense." She set a plate in front of him, considerably more edible than anything he'd produced, and settled across the small table with her own. "Just gratitude next time, and perhaps a willingness to let the woman who's kept herself alive on this ridge for 6 years is a deal." He took a bite, found it predictably far better than his own attempt. "Otis teach you to cook too?" Otis could barely cook either. She smiled at the memory. "We survived mostly on beans and stubbornness the first few years. I taught myself the rest, out of necessity, same as I taught myself most things." "You're a remarkable woman, Odessa Ashworth." "I know." She said it without a trace of false modesty, matter of fact, the way she said most true things. It took me a long while to believe it myself, but I know it now. Outside, thunder rumbled low and distant along the western ridge, the first murmur of the storm that would, in the days ahead, arrive in earnest. But for one small, ordinary morning, burned bacon and easy laughter, and 2 people slowly, carefully falling in love, felt like the only weather that mattered. That night, Elias couldn't sleep, because his mind kept turning the same question over, again and again, refusing to let it rest. If this well fed half the valley, if Josiah Holt had poisoned it on purpose, patient, calculating, waiting 11 years for somebody foolish enough to dig it back open, then Bardwell Holt hadn't ridden up to Briar Hollow by accident, asking careful questions in a fine coat. He'd been waiting, the same way his father had waited, which meant he already knew things about this land that Elias and Odessa were only now starting to piece together, which meant somewhere, buried in old paper same as the deed Elias had found in the barn, there had to be more proof. Of the story Josiah Holt had spent a lifetime trying to bury quiet. He rose before dawn, restless, and found himself climbing the ridge to Odessa's cabin instead of waiting for her to come to him. She answered the door before he even knocked, like she'd been expecting him, or hadn't slept either. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I." She stepped back, let him in, and for the first time Elias found himself standing inside 4 walls that belonged entirely to her small, neat, every surface holding some trace of a life, built careful and deliberate out of very little. A shelf of books, spines worn soft with reading. A trunk in the corner, old leather, brass fittings gone dark with age. "I've been thinking about Otis, about what he knew and never told me." "You think he knew about the vein? About what Josiah Holt was really after?" "I think Otis knew a great deal more than he ever let on." Odessa moved to the trunk in the corner, knelt beside it, her big hands surprisingly gentle on the latch. "He kept papers, journals, things he never let me read while he was alive. Said some stories weren't mine to carry yet. I never had the heart to go through them after he died. Felt too much like trespassing on a grave. Maybe it's time." She looked up at him a long moment, something vulnerable moving behind her usual steadiness. "Maybe it is," she said, and opened the trunk. They spread the contents across her small table by lamplight journals, brittle with age, filled with a careful, cramped handwriting that covered decades of notes on wells and water tables, and the slow, patient work of listening to ground most men never bothered to hear. Letters, some addressed to Otis, some drafted but never sent. The ink faded soft with time. Elias worked through one stack while Odessa worked through another, and for a long while the only sound in the cabin was the rustle of old paper and the low hiss of the lamp. Then he found it. A letter dated 22 years back, the paper so brittle it nearly crumbled at the fold. Addressed not to Otis, but from him a draft, never sent. The handwriting hurried, urgent, nothing like the careful notes surrounding it. Elias read it once, then again slower, his hands beginning to shake. Odessa. Something in his voice made her look up immediately. What is it? He held the letter out, though his voice had gone rough, uncertain, like the words themselves might not survive being spoken aloud. This is addressed to my father. His throat tightened around the words. Otis wrote a letter to my father 22 years ago, warning him. Odessa went very still. Warning him about what? About Josiah Holt. Elias's eyes moved back down the page, reading it again like it might say something different the second time. Otis knew him. Knew what he was doing to families across 3 territories, buying up water rights, quiet, patient, ruining men who trusted him. He wrote to warn my father before the ranch was ever lost, before any of it happened. Did your father ever get it? I don't know. Elias's hand shook holding the paper. It's a draft. Never sent, or sent and never answered. Or I don't know, Odessa. But Otis knew. Years before either of us was ever born into this mess, Otis Renner already knew what kind of man Josiah Holt was, and tried to stop it, and failed. And then, he ended up here. Odessa's voice had gone hollow, disbelieving. In Widow's Basin, guarding a well Josiah Holt poisoned. Taking in a girl nobody else wanted. All of it circling back to the same man over and over for 20 years. And neither of us ever knew we were standing in the middle of the same story. Elias set the letter down carefully, his hands still trembling. Otis didn't just teach you to sit into ground, he said slowly, the pieces falling together even as he spoke them. He spent his whole life trying to warn people about the Holts, trying to stop them before they could ruin one more family. And he never stopped, not until the day he died. Odessa reached across the table and took his hand, her grip fierce, grounding. Then we finish what he started, she said. Both of us. Together. They rode into Coldwater Flat together 3 days later for supplies, for information, for the simple necessity of understanding how much of the valley already knew what they were only now piecing together. The town had changed since Elias's first visit. Not dramatically. Not in any way a stranger passing through would have noticed. But he noticed the way fewer eyes slid away from him now, the way a woman outside the mercantile nodded to Odessa instead of crossing the street to avoid her, small and quiet and entirely unprecedented. Words traveling, Odessa murmured low, as they tied their horses outside the general store. About the wells coming back. Good word or bad? Depends who you ask. She nodded toward the saloon across the street, where a knot of men stood clustered outside, voices pitched low but tense. Some folks are grateful. Some folks are scared of what it means if Holt decides to take that gratitude personal. They'd barely stepped inside the mercantile, when the bell over the door hadn't finished ringing, before a man Elias didn't recognize blocked their path, broad, unshaven, a gun sitting low and deliberate on his hip, in a way that wasn't for show. You'd be Barrow. The man didn't bother with pleasantries. Mr. Holt sends his regards. Says to remind you a well doesn't belong to whoever digs it. Belongs to whoever's got the paper and the patience to prove it in court. Tell Mr. Holt, Elias said evenly. I've got paper of my own, and I'm developing a fair bit of patience myself. The man's eyes flicked to Odessa, lingering with a slow, deliberate insolence that made Elias's whole body go tight. And the monster, the man said, tell her Mr. Holt's got questions about her too. About where exactly she comes from. Funny thing, digging through old county records. Names have a way of turning up where you least expect them. Odessa didn't move, didn't so much as blink, but something in her stillness had gone dangerous coiled, and Elias understood watching her that, whatever threat the man intended, it had landed somewhere far deeper than he'd meant it to. Get out of our way, Elias said quietly. The man smiled, unhurried, and stepped aside with an exaggerated little bow that fooled nobody. Enjoy your supplies, he said. while the well's still yours to enjoy. They finished their business quick after that, neither one saying much, and it wasn't until they were well clear of town, riding the long trail back toward the ridge, that Odessa finally spoke. He knows something. Her voice had gone tight, careful. About my name. About where I come from. I don't know how, but he does. What is there to know? Odessa was quiet a long moment, her jaw working, and when she finally answered, her voice had dropped low enough that Elias had to lean in to catch it over the wind. My family name, she said, is Ashworth. I haven't spoken it out loud in 6 years. Haven't let anybody in this valley know it, because the last time that name meant anything to anybody around here, it meant a family that lost everything to a man with a smile, just like Bardwell Holt's. Elias felt the ground shift beneath him, invisible but absolute, the same way it had the night he'd found Josiah Holt's signature in the barn. Odessa, he said slowly, did your family lose land? Here in this valley? She didn't answer right away. Just kept riding, eyes fixed on the trail ahead, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone smaller than he'd ever heard it. I don't know, she admitted. I never let myself ask. It was easier not to know. Easier to be nobody's daughter than to be the daughter of a family that lost everything, the same man who poisoned this well. We're going to find out. Elias going to find out, he said again, firmer, reaching over to take her hand as their horses walked side by side down the long trail home. Whatever that man in town thinks he knows about you, we're going to know it first, and know it better, and know it on our own terms, not his. Odessa's fingers tightened around his, and for a long while neither one of them said anything else at all, the wind carrying their silence all the way back to Briar Hollow. The fire came 2 nights later. Elias woke to the smell of smoke thick in his lungs before his mind had even finished the climb up out of sleep, and by the time he was on his feet, boots half-laced, rifle in hand, the whole eastern edge of the barn was already lit up orange against the black sky. Odessa! His voice tore raw out of his throat as he ran. Odessa! The barn. She was already there. Already moving, hauling water from the newly running well in buckets too small for the size of the disaster, throwing them against flames that only laughed and climbed higher. Elias grabbed a second bucket and joined her, and for a long, brutal stretch of minutes there was nothing in the world but heat and smoke and the terrible orange light, and the two of them, working side by side, refusing to let this be the thing that beat them. It wasn't enough. Not against a fire that size. Not against a fire, Elias understood even as he fought it, that hadn't started by accident. Because the smell wasn't right. Under the smoke, sharp and chemical, the same bitter tang he'd found in that cracked jar, buried beside the well 11 years dead. Coal oil. Somebody had poured coal oil along the barn's dry timber and set a match to it. On purpose. In the dark. While they slept. They saved what they could, the horses, screaming and wild-eyed, driven clear before the flames reached their stalls. A portion of the feed store, dragged out into the yard through smoke thick enough to blind, but the barn itself, the same barn Odessa had spent 6 years quietly patching and holding together with her own 2 hands, burned down to its bones before the night was through. They stood together in the gray light of dawn, soot-streaked, exhausted, staring at what was left. Black timber. Ash still smoking in the pale morning air. The frame Odessa had reinforced with such careful, patient work, collapsed now into a ruin no amount of patching could fix. He did this. Elias's voice came out hoarse, half from smoke, half from fury. Holt did this. We can't prove it. Odessa's voice had gone flat, exhausted, but underneath the exhaustion, Elias heard something harder. Something that had stopped being afraid and started being angry instead. Not yet. We don't need to prove it to know it. No. She stared at the ruin a long moment. We don't. Elias knelt at the edge of the ash, found something half buried in the char, a scrap of cloth, the same fine weave he remembered from a coat that had ridden up to their fence line one gold evening not so long ago. He held it up without a word. Odessa's jaw tightened. He's getting careless, she said. Or he wants us to know it was him. Wants us scared enough to give up and sell, before it gets worse. Then he doesn't know us very well. No. Something fierce moved across her face, driving the exhaustion back. He doesn't. And he's about to learn that a barn burning down doesn't scare off people who've already lost everything they were ever afraid of losing. They spent the rest of that day clearing debris, salvaging what timber hadn't burned clean through, and by afternoon a strange thing had started happening. Riders, coming up the trail in 1s and 2s, Amos Dell among them, then Pruitt, then Faces. Elias didn't recognize, but Odessa apparently did. Folks from 3 different ranches up and down the valley, arriving with tools and lumber and grim, determined faces. Heard about the fire, Amos said, swinging down, already rolling up his sleeves. Figured a barn raising's easier work with more hands on it. You didn't have to come, Elias said. No, Amos agreed. Wasn't obligation that brought us. Was gratitude. Half these folks have got water running in their wells again on account of what you two dug loose up here. Seemed only right to help you build back what somebody tried to burn down for it. By evening, a new frame stood where the old one had fallen, rough and unfinished but rising all the same. A dozen neighbors working alongside them, with a fierce, quiet determination that hadn't existed in Coldwater Flat 2 weeks earlier. Odessa stood in the middle of it all, soot still on her face, watching strangers who'd once called her a monster hammerboards into place on her behalf. And Elias saw something move across her expression that he'd never seen there before. Something that looked, for the first time in 6 long years, like belonging. That night, once the last of the neighbors had ridden home, and the new frame stood quiet and skeletal against the stars, Elias found Odessa sitting alone at the edge of the well, staring down into water that hadn't existed a month before. He sat beside her without asking, close enough now that it felt natural, unremarkable. The way sitting close to her had somehow stopped being a thing either of them thought twice about. You did that, he said quietly. Whatever happened today. However this valley used to see you. You did that, just by refusing to give up on a well everybody else had already buried. We did that. No. He shook his head. I bought paper, Odessa. You're the one who spent 6 years standing guard over something worth saving, alone, while an entire town called you a monster for it. Today wasn't about me. She was quiet a long moment, watching the water. I used to think, she said finally, that being this size meant I'd always be alone, that no room would ever be built wide enough, no door tall enough, no man brave enough to stand this close without flinching. She turned to look at him, something raw and unguarded in her pale eyes. You've never flinched. Not once. Not the first day, not tonight, not any day in between. Why would I? Most men do. Her voice had gone soft, uncertain, in a way he'd rarely heard from her, even the kind ones. There's always some part of them that keeps a careful distance, like they're afraid of what might happen if they got too close. Elias reached up, slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and rested his palm against the side of her face. She didn't pull away. I've buried everything I was ever afraid of losing, he said quietly, which means I've got nothing left to protect myself with. No careful distance, no safe ground to retreat to. His thumb traced gentle along her cheekbone. Just you. Just this valley. Just whatever we're building here. Together, one burned barn and one dead well at a time. That's a strange kind of courage, Odessa murmured. Being brave because you've got nothing left to lose. Maybe. He held her gaze, steady. Or maybe I've finally found something worth being afraid of losing again. And decided to be brave anyway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The stars wheeled slow overhead, and the water in the well below them caught the faint light, dark and patient and alive. And when Odessa finally leaned down carefully, achingly, slow, folding the great distance of her height down toward him with a gentleness that undid something in his chest, Elias met her halfway. The kiss was soft, careful. 2 people who'd both spent years learning how much the world could take from them, choosing, deliberately, to risk one more thing worth losing. When they finally parted, Odessa's forehead resting against his, her breath unsteady, in a way he'd never once heard from her before, she let out a small, startled laugh. Well, she said, that's certainly going to give Coldwater Flat something new to talk about. Elias grinned, something light and unguarded moving through him for the first time in longer than he could remember. Let them talk. Word of the kiss, predictably, reached Coldwater Flat before Elias had even finished his morning coffee. You two aren't exactly subtle, Amos informed him dryly the next time their paths crossed, delivering a fresh batch of nails alongside an expression of barely concealed amusement. Pruitt's wife spotted you from the Ridge Road, apparently, and by the time it reached the Mercantile this morning, the story had you two married with a full harvest of children already. We are not married. Give it time. Amos's eyes crinkled with the closest thing to a grin Elias had seen from him yet. Half the town's placing wagers on how long before you make it official. Mrs. Coyle at the boarding house is already knitting something suspiciously shaped like a wedding quilt. That seems presumptuous. This is a small territory, Mr. Barrow, with precious little entertainment besides weather and gossip. You and Miss Ashworth have handed folks a fair bit of both. Amos swung back up onto his horse, still grinning. For what it's worth, most of the wagers are hoping you win. There's something a valley likes about watching two people who've been alone a long while finally stop being alone. Odessa, when Elias relayed the conversation later that evening, took it with considerably more grace than he'd managed. Let them wager, she said, settling beside him at the fire, entirely unbothered. I spent 6 years as this valley's ghost story. I find I don't mind terribly being its romance instead. Even the part where Mrs. Coyle's knitting you a wedding quilt. Especially that part. Her expression softened, warmer now, more certain than it had ever been that first careful week. Though you'll have to actually ask me something before she finishes it, or the poor woman's going to have wasted a great deal of good wool. Elias felt his chest go warm and unsteady, in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Is that an invitation? That, Odessa said, leaning down to kiss him again, slow and certain, is a promise. When the time's right. Not before Bardwell Holt's dealt with, and not before Coldwater Flat finishes deciding whether it's brave enough to fully embrace a giant for a neighbor. But a promise all the same. I can wait. Good. She settled against him, watching the fire, because I intend to make you. Amos Dell rode up again 3 days later, this time with something more than lumber and nails. He carried a satchel, worn leather, gone soft with age, and a look on his weathered face that told Elias before a word had been spoken that whatever was inside mattered. You asked me once if the rest of town knew about the Holts. Amos dismounted slow, joints protesting as always, and held the satchel out. After the fire, after everything. I got to thinking. My brother kept records before he lost his ranch and lost his nerve along with it. County records, mostly deeds, water rights, transfers, the kind of paper trail a careful man keeps when he starts suspecting the folks he's dealing with aren't quite honest. You've had these the whole time? Had them boxed up in my attic for 30 years, gathering dust, telling myself there wasn't any point digging up old grief that couldn't be undone. Amos's jaw tightened. Watching that barn burn changed my mind. Man doesn't get to sit on the truth forever just because it's easier than facing it. Elias took the satchel with careful hands and carried it inside, where Odessa was waiting, and together they spread its contents across the same table, where they'd found Otis's letter days before. Deeds, transfer records, a ledger careful and methodical, tracking land sales across Widow's Basin going back nearly 40 years, and they're 3 pages in, a name that made Odessa go very still. Ashworth. Elias watched her read it, watched the color drain slow from her face as her eyes moved down the page. This is my family's land. Her voice had gone hollow, disbelieving. This Elias. This is the original deed. Before Briar Hollow was ever Briar Hollow. Before it belonged to whoever sold it to the man who sold it to you. What does it says? Her hands were shaking now, holding the brittle paper like it might shatter. It says 600 acres, this exact stretch of ground, granted to Silas Ashworth in 1851. My grandfather. She looked up, something breaking open behind her eyes. This was ours. Before Holt. Before anybody. This land belonged to my family first. Elias pulled the next document from the stacked transfer record, dated 11 years back, the same year the well went dry. Same year Odessa had first come to Widow's Basin half-starved and grieving. His eyes moved fast down the page, and what he found made his stomach turn cold. Odessa. Look at this. She took the paper from him, and as she read, her whole body went rigid. This transfer, she said slowly, each word deliberate, careful, like she was forcing herself to say something her mind kept trying to reject, is signed by my father, selling this land to Josiah Holt. For a sum this is nothing, Elias. This is less than 1/10 what the land was worth even then. Could your father have sold it willingly? My father died 3 years before this date. Her voice had gone flat, dangerous. I attended his funeral myself, which means whoever signed this wasn't him. Wasn't. Odessa set the paper down with great care, like setting down something that might otherwise shatter the whole table. This is forged. Josiah Holt forged my dead father's signature to steal land that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. The same land he then poisoned. The same land he sold off cheap to the next unlucky fool, over and over, watching each one fail and flee, patient, waiting for somebody to dig the well back open so he could swoop in and claim the water rights were rightfully his all along. Elias felt the full shape of it settle over him, cold and enormous. Your family didn't lose this land, he said slowly. It was stolen. And you've spent 6 years guarding a well that was rightfully yours the entire time, without ever knowing it. Odessa sat back, staring at the papers spread across the table, at 40 years of quiet theft laid bare in careful damning ink. 6 years, she said, her voice breaking for the first time since Elias had known her, standing guard over my own grandfather's land, wondering why it felt like it belonged to me, why I couldn't leave it, couldn't let it go, couldn't stop listening to ground that every instinct in me said was worth protecting. It was calling you home. It was. She looked up at him, tears finally breaking free down a face that had held itself steady through 6 years of loneliness and grief. This was my home, Elias, all along. And Josiah Holt stole it with a dead man's forged signature, and his son has spent this whole month trying to buy back what his own family stole in the first place. Elias reached across the table and took her hand, steady, certain. Then we're not just fighting for a well anymore, he said. We're fighting to give you back what should have been yours from the start. They sat with the papers long into the night, working out, piece by careful piece, what came next. We can't just confront him, Elias said, pacing the small cabin, while Odessa sat with her grandfather's deed held careful in both hands, like something precious enough to break. Holt will deny everything. Burn the evidence if he thinks it's coming for him. We need this recorded somewhere. He can't touch it. The Territorial Land Office, in Laramie. Odessa didn't look up from the deed. 3 days' ride. If we can get these papers filed there, entered into the official record, it won't matter what Holt tries to burn or bury after. The truth will already belong to somebody besides us. Then that's where we go. Elias, she finally looked up, something careful and afraid moving behind her eyes. You understand what happens if we do this. Holt's not to sit quiet while we ride off to file evidence against his family. Whatever he's willing to do to a barn, he'll be willing to do worse to stop us reaching Laramie. No, I mean it. Truly. This isn't a fence dispute anymore. This is a man's whole inheritance, his father's whole scheme, laid bare in ink he can't argue away. Men like that don't lose gracefully. Elias knelt in front of her, took both her hands in his, steady, despite the fear he could feel building in his own chest, too. I've already lost everything a man can lose, he said quietly. A wife, a herd, a father who drank himself into the ground rather than face what Josiah Holt took from him. I am not about to let his son take one more thing, from one more person I love, not without a fight. Odessa went very still. Love. Elias hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it, hadn't done anything but let it slip out true and unguarded in the middle of a conversation about deeds and danger, and a 3-day ride toward Laramie. But he didn't take it back. Yes, he said simply. Love. I don't know when it happened. Exactly. Somewhere between a fence post and a falling tree and a bottle of something homemade passed back and forth by firelight. But it happened, Odessa, and I'm not sorry for it, whatever comes next. Something broke open behind, her careful eyes not sorrow this time, but something warmer, something that had been waiting a long while to be spoken aloud and finally had permission. I love you too, she said, her voice rough with the admission. God help us both, Elias Barrow, I do. They held each other a long while in the lamplight, the papers spread forgotten on the table beside them, and for one brief, suspended moment, the danger waiting outside the cabin walls felt very far away indeed. It would not stay far away for long. They left for Laramie at first light, the deed and Otis's letters wrapped careful in oilcloth and tucked deep in Elias's saddlebag, Amos Dell insisting on riding with them as far as the Territorial Road. 2 more sets of eyes on that trail won't hurt, he'd said, swinging up onto his horse with a determination that belied his 60-some years. And frankly, I've got my own reasons for wanting to see Josiah Holt's dirty dealing dragged out into daylight. Even 11 years too late for my brother. The first day passed uneventful, the 3 of them making good time across open country, the terrain rising slow toward higher ground, where the air ran cooler and the grass, unbelievably, grew green and tall in a way Widow's Basin hadn't seen in over a decade. It was the second day when things went wrong. They'd stopped at a narrow crossing where the trail cut through a stand of cottonwoods, the only shade for miles, and Elias felt it before he saw it, that particular stillness that meant something in the landscape had changed. Some balance shifted that his cavalry instincts recognized faster than his conscious mind could name. Riders, Odessa's voice had gone low, urgent. 203, coming up fast from the east. They emerged from the tree line before Elias had time to do more than reach for his rifle. 3 men, the same broad-shouldered one from the mercantile among them, guns already drawn, faces set hard and businesslike in a way that made clear this wasn't a conversation they'd come to have. "Mr. Holt sends his regrets," the lead man said, his horse sidestepping nervous beneath him. "Says he'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen to travelers on such a lonely stretch of road. Says maybe you ought to turn around, head back to the basin, forget whatever business you think you've got in Laramie. Tell Mr. Holt," Elias said, keeping his voice level despite his racing pulse, "that we've got business with the Territorial Land Office that's none of his concern. He seems to think otherwise." The standoff held a long, taut moment. 3 armed men against Elias, Odessa, and an aging land clerk with nothing but a hunting knife and 60 years of stubbornness to his name. Elias's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last, his hand tight and ready on his rifle stock. Then Odessa moved, not toward her own weapon, toward the lead rider's horse, faster than a woman her size had any right to move, and before the man could react, she'd seized his horse's bridle in one enormous fist and hauled the animal sideways with such sudden, overwhelming force that both horse and rider went down hard in the dust, the man's pistol firing wild into empty sky as he fell. Chaos broke loose. The second rider's horse spooked at the gunshot, rearing, throwing its rider clear. The third, caught between fighting and fleeing, chose fleeing, wheeling his mount around, and bolting back the way he'd come without a second glance at his fallen companions. Elias had his rifle trained on the lead man before he'd even finished hitting the ground. "Don't." His voice came out, cold, steady, the voice of a man who'd done this before, in worse circumstances, against worse odds. "Get up slow, get on your horse, and ride back to whoever's paying you and tell him it didn't work." The man scrambled up, wide-eyed, staring at Odessa with which that had shed every trace of its earlier confidence. "She's not human," he muttered, backing toward his skittish horse. "That's not no woman does that. Not natural. She's the most human person I've ever known," Elias said, low and dangerous. "Which is more than I can say for the man who sent you." The rider fled without another word, and the second man, already scrambling for his own mount, went with him, leaving the 3 travelers alone again on the empty trail, dust settling slow around them in the afternoon light. Odessa stood breathing hard, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, and Elias crossed to her immediately, checking her over with careful, urgent hands. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice was rough. Just she looked down at her own hands like they belonged to somebody else. "I don't like using it that way, my size. Like a weapon instead of a tool. Otis always said strength used in anger costs a person something they don't always get back. You didn't have a choice." "I know." She met his eyes, something raw and uncertain there. "Doesn't make it sit any easier." Amos, who'd remained frozen through the entire encounter, finally exhaled a long, shaking breath. "Well," he said, voice unsteady, "I don't believe I've ever seen anything quite like that in 60-some years of living in this territory." Despite everything, Odessa managed a small, tired smile. "Neither had they," she said, which was rather the point. They pressed on toward Laramie without further incident, though all 3 of them rode more careful now, more watchful, understanding fully for the first time just how far Bardwell Holt was willing to go to keep the truth buried. Laramie sprawled larger than anything Elias had seen since leaving Kansas. Real streets, real buildings of brick and cut stone, a territorial land office with a flag snapping smart in the wind above its door. They found the office clerk to be a careful, unhurried man named Whitfield, who listened to their story with an expression that gave away nothing until Elias laid the forged transfer document on the counter between them, followed by the original 1,851 grant, followed by Otis's letters, followed finally by the water rights record Amsmus had kept boxed away for 30 years. Whitfield studied each document a long, silent while, adjusting his spectacles, and when he finally lit up, something had shifted in his careful expression. "You understand," he said slowly. "The family you're accusing here carries no small amount of influence in this territory. Bardwell Holt has friends in Cheyenne. Money that opens doors most men never seal and walk through." "We understand," Odessa said. "We came anyway." "That," Whitfield said, "is either very brave or very foolish. We've been told that before." Whitfield studied her a long moment. Elias watched him take in her size, the same way every stranger did, and watched something shift in his expression that wasn't fear, wasn't mockery, but something closer to simple, careful assessment. Ashworth, he said finally, tapping the 1,851 Grant. I know that name. Old family, this territory. Respected before. He paused, choosing his words with evident care, before certain irregularities began appearing in the county records some years back. I'd wondered at the time whether anybody would ever come asking about them. You knew I suspected. Whitfield's jaw tightened. Suspecting and proving are different animals, Miss Ashworth. A land clerk who goes accusing powerful men of forgery without ironclad proof doesn't stay a land clerk very long. But this, he gestured at the spread documents, the dead man's forged signature, the letters detailing decades of quiet theft. This is proof. Real proof, properly documented, properly witnessed. He looked up, something resolved settling into his careful features. I'll file it today, he said. Enter it into permanent record. Once it's recorded, Mr. Holt's lawyers can argue all they like, but they can't make it disappear. The truth will exist, officially, whether he likes it or not. Relief flooded through Elias so fast it nearly buckled his knees. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Whitfield's expression sobered. Filing this starts a process. A slow one, likely. Courts move careful in cases this size, especially against a family with Holt's resources. And in my experience, powerful men rarely take kindly to having their theft exposed, however proper the process. We understand that too, Odessa said quietly. Then you understand, Whitfield said, that the danger isn't over. It's likely only just beginning. They stayed in Laramie only long enough to see the documents formally entered, watching Whitfield's careful hand record, each page into a ledger that would, from that moment forward, exist independent of anything Bardwell Holt might try to do to silence it. The ride home felt different than the ride out, lighter in some ways. The weight of secrecy finally lifted, but heavier too, freighted now with the certain knowledge that whatever came next would not come gently. They reached Widow's Basin on the evening of the 6th day, tired, dust-worn, and found the valley waiting for them, changed once more. Because word, it seemed, had already traveled ahead of them. Bardwell Holt did not sleep well that first night at the old Miller place, though none of the men camped around him would ever have guessed it from the careful stillness of his face. He sat apart from the fire, apart from his hired men's low, coarse talk, and stared out at the dark shape of the ridge that hid Briar Hollow Ranch from view, turning an old, familiar argument over in his mind the way he'd been turning it for 20 years. Because he remembered his father sometimes, in unguarded moments like this one, remembered Josiah Holt's hands, cold and precise, teaching a boy of 12 how to read a ledger, how to spot the exact moment a struggling rancher's desperation turned to weakness, how to smile warm and generous, while extending a loan specifically designed to fail. Kindness, his father used to say, is simply patience with a purpose, Bardwell. You give a man just enough rope to believe you're helping him. Then you watch, quiet, patient, while he hangs himself with it. Bardwell had believed that once, had built his entire understanding of the world around it, the way a boy builds his understanding of the world around whatever his father hands him, unquestioning, until questioning becomes a luxury he no longer knows how to afford. But watching Elias Barrow stand unflinching at that fence line, watching Odessa Ashworth throw a grown man off his horse to protect people who'd once called her a monster and had, somehow, impossibly, learned to call her something else instead. Something had shifted in Bardwell these past weeks that he did not entirely welcome and could not entirely suppress. Doubt. He had never permitted himself doubt before. Doubt was, his father had always insisted, simply weakness wearing a more respectable coat. You're quiet tonight. One of his hired men, the broad-shouldered one who'd fled the failed ambush on the Laramie Road, settled near him with the easy familiarity of a man well paid for his discretion. Thinking about my father, Bardwell said, before he'd quite decided to say it, aloud. Wasn't he the one built all this? The water rights? The whole operation? He was. Bardwell watched the fire a long moment. Died 11 years back, still believing he'd built something worth being proud of. Never once asked himself what it cost the families he built it on top of. And you? I used to believe the cost didn't matter, that the strong simply took what the weak couldn't hold on to, and that was the whole of the world's arithmetic. Nothing more complicated than that. His jaw tightened, but I've watched an entire valley rally around two people I was certain I could frighten into submission inside a week. Watched an old land clerk risk everything he's got left to expose a theft that happened before I was even old enough to understand what my father was doing. And I find myself wondering lately whether the arithmetic I inherited was ever truly as simple as he claimed. The hired man said nothing, wisely recognizing this wasn't a conversation that wanted an answer. It doesn't matter, Bardwell said finally, quiet, mostly to himself. Whatever doubt I'm entertaining tonight, I've built my entire life on my father's foundation. Every dollar, every connection, every ounce of standing I hold in this territory traces back to exactly the kind of ruthlessness I'm second-guessing at a campfire like some green boy fresh off the trail. He stood, brushing dust from his fine coat, his expression hardening back into the careful, cold composure his father had spent a lifetime teaching him to wear. Doubt is a luxury for men who haven't already committed everything to a particular way of being in the world. I committed a long time ago. Tomorrow we ride. He walked back toward his tent without another word, and if some smaller, quieter part of him recognized the lie in his own certainty, recognized that a man who'd truly made peace with his father's cruelty wouldn't need to work so hard convincing himself of it. He buried that recognition the same careful, practiced way he'd learned to bury everything inconvenient since he was 12 years old, watching his father teach him exactly how kindness could be weaponized into ruin. The first sign came a mile out from the ranch, where they found Pruitt waiting astride his horse at the crossroads, his face drawn tight with worry. "Been watching for you 3 days," he said, before any of them had a chance to dismount. "Holt's been through the basin like a storm since word got out you'd ridden for Laramie. Threatening folks. Telling anybody who'll listen that filing forged papers is a hanging offense, that you'll all regret ever crossing him. Has he done anything?" Odessa's voice had gone sharp, urgent. "To the ranch? To anyone? Not yet. But he's not alone anymore." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Brought in more men. Hired guns by the look of them, not the sort you find doing honest work in Coldwater Flat. Word is he's set up camp on the old Miller place, less than 2 miles from your well." Elias felt something cold settle into his chest, the particular stillness that came before violence, a feeling he remembered well from another life entirely. How many men? 6, maybe 8, hard to say for certain. And the town? Scared. Pruitt didn't dress it up. But angrier than they are scared, I think. What you two dug loose up there, the well's running again. Clear down the basin folks aren't willing to just hand that back over to a man who poisoned it for a decade out of pure greed. There's talk of standing with you, if it comes to that. Real talk. Not just words over whiskey. They rode the rest of the way to Briar Hollow with careful, watchful eyes, and found the ranch itself untouched, the well still running clear, the new barn frame still standing, Odessa's cabin on the ridge undisturbed. But waiting in the yard, mounted, patient, flanked by 2 of his hired men, sat Bardwell Holt himself, his fine coat dusted now, with the honest dirt of a man who'd finally stopped sending others to do his business for him. "Mr. Barrow." His voice had lost every trace of its earlier easy charm. "Miss Ashworth, I understand congratulations are in order. Quite the trip to Laramie. You know why we went. I know exactly why you went." Holt's jaw was tight, his composure fraying at the edges in a way Elias hadn't seen before. "Filed papers against my family. Against a forgery you can't even prove I had a hand in." "We can prove your father did," Elias said. "That's enough." Something dangerous flickered across Holt's face. "My father," he said, "spent his whole life building something for this family. Water rights across half a territory, patient, careful, the kind of empire that takes generations to build properly. And you two, a broken cavalryman and an oversized orphan. Nobody ever wanted to think you're going to unravel it with some brittle old paper and a sympathetic clerk in Laramie." "Careful," Elias said, low in warning. "Or what?" Holt's smile had turned cold, cruel. Nothing left of the charm he'd worn the first time he'd ridden up this trail. "You'll fight me? With what, Mr. Barrow? A rifle and a woman who throws men off horses? I have got 8 armed men camped 2 miles from here and a fortune large enough to make this entire territory's legal system move exactly as slow as I need it to. Your filed papers will sit in some Laramie office, gathering dust for years, while I decide exactly how patient I intend to be about taking back what belongs to my family." "It never belonged to your family," Odessa said, her voice steady despite the danger radiating off every word Holt spoke. "It belonged to mine. And you're going to give it back." Holt looked at her a long moment, something almost admiring beneath the contempt. "You really believe that?" he said. "That the law, that decency, that some old clerk's ledger is going to matter more than 8 armed men and a fortune built specifically to make sure it never does?" He shook his head slowly. You've got courage, Miss Ashworth. I'll grant you that. Doesn't mean you've got sense. He gathered his reins, preparing to ride, and paused, looking back at them both with an expression that had gone cold and final. You've got until the next full moon, he said. 9 days. Sign this well and this land back over to me. Quiet, no more filed papers. No more clerks in Laramie, and I'll let you both ride out of this valley with your lives. His gaze lingered a moment too long on Odessa, something predatory beneath the words. Refuse, and I promise you, this well will run dry again, one way or another, and this time, I won't be nearly so patient about how I make that happen. He rode off with his men, unhurried, certain, and Elias and Odessa stood together in the yard of Briar Hollow, the well running clear and cold behind them, watching the dust of his departure settle slow over a valley that had, in the space of a single conversation, become a battlefield with 9 days left on the clock. He means it, Odessa said quietly. Every word. 9 days isn't very long, Elias. He turned to face her, took both her hands in his, steady despite the fear coiling tight in his chest. No, he agreed. It isn't. Which means we'd best spend every one of them getting ready. Above them, the first sliver of the coming full moon hung pale against the darkening sky, patient, waiting, counting down the days, toward whatever reckoning was coming for Widow's Basin. The next morning, Elias rode to Coldwater Flat alone, while Odessa stayed behind, reinforcing the well's stone lip against whatever Holt might attempt. He found the town already talking, the news of Holt's ultimatum, having outraced him down the trail, the way news always seemed to in a valley this small. But what he hadn't expected, walking into the mercantile, was the sight of nearly a dozen townsfolk gathered there already, Amos Dell at the center of them, a rough map of the basin spread across the counter. There he is. Amos waved him over without preamble. We were just discussing what happens next. You don't have to involve yourselves in this. Wasn't a question of involving ourselves, said a woman. Elias, vaguely recognized from the mercantile counter, arms crossed, jaw set firm. Bardwell Holt poisoned water that half of us have been drinking, one way or another, our whole lives. My children have wells running again that were dry since before they were born. This stopped being just your fight the moment those wells started flowing. Murmurs of agreement moved through the gathered group, and Elias felt something tighten in his throat that had nothing to do with fear. 9 days, Amos said, tapping the map. Not much time, but enough if we're smart about it. Holt's got 8 hired guns camped on the old Miller place. We've got, what, a dozen able hands here. More if we send word further down the basin. We're not gunfighters, Elias said carefully. Most of you, no offense, but no offense taken. We're not. A rancher Elias didn't know spoke up from the back, weathered and grim. But we know this land better than any hired gun Holt dragged in from wherever he found them. We know every fold of ground, every place a man could hide, every trail those riders will have to cross if they mean to reach your ranch. And there's another thing. Amos's expression had gone careful, calculating. Holt's men are hired, paid to be here, not devoted to him, not the way you and Miss Ashworth are devoted to that land. Paid men have a way of losing their nerve once the pay stops looking worth the risk. The planning stretched long into the afternoon watch rotations along the trails leading toward Briar Hollow, signal fires arranged on the high ridges to warn of approaching riders, a network of neighbors ready to converge at the first sign of trouble. It wasn't an army. It wasn't anything close to what 8 hired guns and Bardwell Holt's fortune could theoretically bring to bear, but it was something. A whole valley, quietly, deliberately choosing to stand together, rather than watch one more family get ruined by the same greed that had already ruined so many others. Elias rode home that evening with something steadier in his chest than fear, and found Odessa waiting at the fence line, watching for him against the fading light. Well? She asked as he swung down from his horse. We're not alone in this, he said. Not anymore. Something in her face eased, just slightly the tension she'd been carrying all day, finally finding a small measure of relief. A valley only survives by remembering it's a valley, she said quietly. That was Otis's, near the end. Not a scattering of separate ranches, each one alone against whatever comes. A whole thing, connected underground, the same way the water's always been connected, whether folks bothered to notice it or not. Sounds like he was talking about more than water. He usually was. The faintest smile touched her mouth. Otis had a gift for making a person understand 2 things at once, if they were patient enough to listen. They spent the following days in a strange, suspended rhythm, half of every day devoted to practical preparation, reinforcing the well, stockpiling supplies, coordinating with the watch rotations Amos had organized, half devoted, quietly, urgently to each other, as though both of them understood without saying it aloud that 9 days was not a great deal of time, and neither one of them wanted to waste a single hour of it pretending otherwise. Elias taught Odessa to shoot properly on the third evening, though she confessed, with a rare flash of self-deprecating humor, that her aim had never needed to be very good when her hands alone could accomplish most of what a gun was meant for. Still, he said, adjusting her grip on the rifle, standing close behind her in a way that made the lesson considerably less efficient than it might otherwise have been. Better to have the option. Is that the only reason you're standing this close? Absolutely not. She laughed a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and for a moment the looming shadow of Holt's ultimatum receded just far enough to let something lighter breathe between them. On the fifth night, unable to sleep, they sat together at the well's edge, the same spot where they'd shared their first kiss, watching the moon closer to full, with each passing on evening. "Are you afraid?" Odessa asked quietly. "Yes." Elias didn't pretend otherwise. "You?" "Yes." She was quiet a moment. "Not of dying. I made my peace with that a long while back, up on this ridge losing you. Now, what frightens me is everything, after finally understanding what it means to not be alone anymore." He pulled her close, her head resting against his shoulder, despite the awkward difference in their height, both of them folding into whatever comfortable shape two people in love eventually learn to find together. "We're not going to lose each other," he said, with more certainty than he entirely felt. "We've got a whole valley standing with us now. We've got the truth, filed and recorded where Holt can't burn it away. And we've got—" He paused, searching for the words. "We've got something worth fighting for. That's more than Bardwell Holt's ever had, for all his money. He's fighting to keep something stolen. We're fighting to give something back." Odessa was quiet a long moment, watching the moon climb slow toward its fullness. "4 more days," she murmured. "4 more days," he agreed. "And then we find out which one of us this valley was really built for." The trouble came on the 7th day, when Elias least expected it. He'd ridden to the Pruitt place to help reinforce their own well against sabotage, and returned near dusk to find Odessa waiting at the fence with a grim, tight expression that told him something had happened long before she spoke a word. "Amos came by an hour ago." Her voice was carefully controlled, the way it went when she was holding something back. "Holt's men paid him a visit this morning. Not violent. Not yet. Just a reminder that he's an old man alone, with nobody close enough to help if something were to happen to his place in the night." Elias felt fury rise sharp and immediate. "He's threatening Amos now. He's threatening everyone who stood with us." Odessa's jaw tightened, quietly, carefully. No fires, no forged papers he can be caught for. Just enough fear to make folks reconsider how much they really want to stand with two people Bardwell Holt's decided to ruin. "Is Amos backing out?" "No." Something proud moved across her face despite the worry underneath it. "Told Holt's man, in fact, that he'd buried one brother to that family's greed already, and wasn't much afraid of what a second round might cost him. But, her voice dropped, careful. "Not everyone's got Amos's nerve. 2 families pulled their names from the watch rotation this afternoon. Scared. Not wrong to be scared, but scared enough that our numbers are already thinner than they were 3 days ago." Elias absorbed this, working through the tightening knot of strategy and fear in his chest. "Holt's smart," he said finally. "Smarter than I gave him credit for. He can't win a fight against a whole valley standing together. So he's not trying to win a fight. He's trying to make sure the valley stops standing together before it ever comes to one. Can we stop him? I don't know." He met her eyes, honest despite the fear it cost him to be. "But I know we can't let fear decide this before we've even had the chance to fight it properly." That night, the first real storm clouds of the season began gathering along the western ridge, dark and heavy, rolling in slow the way autumn storms did in the basin, patient, building towards something neither weather nor waiting could hold back forever. Elias stood at the fence line watching them come, the same fence he'd rebuilt with his own 2 hands weeks earlier, and felt Odessa come to stand beside him, close, steady, her presence the one certain thing in a valley, suddenly full of uncertainty. 2 days left," she said quietly. 2 days. "Whatever happens," she said, turning to face him fully, the coming storm reflected dark in her pale eyes. I need you to know something. Whatever Holt decides to do, whatever this land cost us before, it's through 6 years I stood on this ridge alone, believing I'd die here just as alone as I'd lived. You changed that, Elias. Whatever comes next, you already changed that. He pulled her close, the wind picking up around them, carrying the first cold breath of the coming storm. We're not done yet, he said, fierce and certain. Not you, not me, not this valley. Whatever Holt's planning, he's about to learn that some things, once they start growing back to life, don't know how to stop. Above them, the first flash of distant lightning lit the western sky, and somewhere out past the ridge, past the old Miller place, where 8 hired guns waited patient for their employer's word, the full moon Bardwell Holt had promised as his deadline climbed slow and certain toward its fullness. 2 days remain, and the whole of Widow's Basin, town and ranch, and every soul who'd ever drawn water from a vein, Josiah Holt had once tried to kill for good, waited together to see which story would finally win. The following day, with the storm clouds still building slow along the western ridge, Odessa disappeared for several hours without explanation, and Elias found her, eventually sitting alone at the small family plot. Behind her cabin, 3 simple markers, weathered by years of basin wind, one of them bearing a name he now understood. Otis Renner, beloved friend, keeper of water and truth. She didn't look up when he approached, just kept staring at the marker, her big hands folded quiet in her lap. I never got to tell him, she said, before Elias had even settled beside her. That I understood finally, why he kept me here all those years instead of sending me somewhere gentler. Somewhere that might have been easier for a girl built the way I was built. Why do you think he did? Because he understood something about this ground that took me years longer to learn. Her voice was soft, contemplative, grief worn smooth by time into something closer to gratitude. That the things worth protecting are rarely the easy things. That a well worth saving is going to fight you the whole way down, same as a person worth loving is going to make you earn it, inch by inch, before they trust you with anything real. He sounds like he loved you very much. He did. In his own quiet way. She reached out, brushed dust from the marker with a tenderness that undid something in Elias's chest every time he witnessed it. Never said it outright, not until near the end. Otis wasn't a man for saying things outright, but he showed it every single day in the patient, careful way he taught me to listen to ground nobody else bothered listening to. In the way he never once, not once in 6 years, looked at me like I was too much for this world to hold. Elias knelt beside her, resting a hand gentle on her shoulder. He'd be proud of you, he said quietly. Standing here now, fighting for what's rightfully yours, instead of just guarding somebody else's ruin. I hope so. Her voice caught just slightly. I've spent 6 years wondering if I was doing right by his memory. Staying here alone, keeping watch over ground that wasn't even mine to keep watch over, except it was. It always was. I just didn't have the proof yet to know it. She was quiet a long moment, watching storm clouds gather thicker along the ridge. I used to think, she said finally, that being too big for the world meant I'd always be alone in it. That no family, no home, no love would ever fit around something built the size I was built. She turned to look at Elias, something fierce and grateful moving behind her pale eyes. Otis proved that wrong first. And you've proved it wrong every single day since you rode into this valley. I intend to keep proving it, Elias said. For a long while yet, if you'll let me. Odessa's mouth curved into the softest smile he'd seen from her yet. Storm light, gathering gray and heavy behind her. I intend to let you, she said, for as long as we've both got. They sat together a while longer at Otis Renner's grave, hands joined, watching the storm build slow toward whatever reckoning waited on the far side of it. And when they finally rose to walk back toward the ranch, neither one of them looked back. Some griefs, Elias was learning, didn't need looking back on to stay honored. Some griefs simply needed to be carried forward, steady and certain, into whatever came next. The 9th day arrived gray and heavy, the storm that had been building all week, finally gathering its full strength along the western ridge, thunderheads stacked dark and towering against a sky that had gone the color of an old bruise. Elias woke before dawn to find Odessa already awake beside him, staring up at the cabin's patched roof, listening to the first low rumble of distant thunder roll across the basin. Today, she said quietly, today. He reached for her hand in the gray half-light. Whatever happens, don't. Her fingers tightened around his. Don't say whatever happens like you're already saying goodbye. We didn't survive everything we've survived, just to lose each other on the last day it mattered. You're right, He kissed her knuckles, steady, certain. "We're not saying goodbye. We're saying ready." They rose and dressed in careful silence, the weight of the coming day settling heavy over every small, ordinary motion. Outside, the ranch had transformed overnight into something between a fortress and a gathering place, Amos Dell already there before full light, along with a dozen other riders from up and down the basin, positioned at careful intervals along the trails, leading toward Briar Hollow, signal fires laid and ready on the high points, rifle checked and rechecked in the tense, quiet way men and women check weapons when they understand fully what the day might ask of them. Word from the watch on the eastern ridge, Amos reported, swinging down from his horse, his weathered face grim beneath the gathering stormlight. "Holt's men are moving. All 8 of them, plus Holt himself, riding this direction. Slow, deliberate. Man who wants to arrive with plenty of daylight left to make his point. How much time do we have? 2 hours. Maybe 3 if this storm slows them any." Elias looked out over the ranch, the well, running clear and strong, the half-finished barn frame, rising stubborn against the gathering dark, the fence he'd rebuilt post by post through weeks, that felt, now like they belonged to an entirely different life. Everything he and Odessa had fought to bring back from the dead, standing here, waiting to see if it would survive one final reckoning. "Then we'd best get into position," he said, "before he decides to arrive early." Odessa moved to stand beside him, tall and steady against the darkening sky, and for a moment, watching her, Elias understood with sudden, absolute clarity exactly what Bardwell Holt had never once understood about the woman he'd spent his whole ultimatum trying to frighten. She was not the monster of Coldwater Flats' old, frightened stories. She was the valley's oldest, most patient guardian, standing, finally, fully, in the daylight she'd earned the hard way, and she was not, whatever came through that gathering storm, going to be moved. Elias. Her voice was low, urgent, her eyes fixed on the darkening western ridge where the first riders had just become visible, small and distant against the storm-black sky. "They're coming." He drew his rifle, steady despite the thunder building, loud and close now overhead, and took his place beside her at the well that had cost them both everything to bring back to life. "Then let them come," he said. "We've got a whole valley standing with us, a dead man's letters proving the truth, and a well that refused to stay buried no matter how hard the Holts tried to kill it." Lightning split the sky above the western ridge, illuminating for one brilliant, terrible instant the shapes of 9 riders, bearing down through the gathering storm Bardwell Holt and his hired guns, arriving exactly on schedule, exactly as promised, to claim a well and a woman, and a stretch of dead ground that had, against every terrible odd, remembered how to live again. Thunder rolled long and heavy across Widow's Basin, and the rain, when it finally broke, came down hard and sudden and unrelenting, the whole sky opening at once as though it too had been holding its breath, waiting 9 long days to finally violently exhale. Somewhere out in that storm, riding steady and unhurried toward Briar Hollow Ranch, Bardwell Holt carried with him every ounce his father's old cruelty, every dollar of his family's stolen fortune, and a fury that had been building since the moment a broken cavalryman and an oversized orphan had dared to dig his family's carefully buried sins back up into the light, and waiting for him, standing together at the mouth of a well that refused to die twice. Elias Barrow and Odessa Ashworth held their ground. Whatever the storm carried with it, whatever reckoning finally arrived with Bardwell Holt's riders through that curtain of driving rain, Widow's Basin was about to learn, once and for all, which story truly belonged to this land. The Deadwell story, buried and poisoned and silenced for 11 long years. Or the story of 2 people the world had already tried to bury once, who had chosen, instead, against every reasonable expectation, to dig each other back up into the light and were not, whatever came next, going down without a fight. The rain came sideways now, driven hard by wind that had forgotten how to be gentle, and through the gray sheets of it, Elias watched 9 riders take shape at the top of the ridge trail. Bardwell Holt in front, 8 men behind him, rifles unslung, moving with the unhurried certainty of men who believed fully that this night would end exactly the way they'd planned it. Positions. Elias's voice cut low through the storm, and around him in the dark he felt more than saw the valley answer. Amos Dell crouched behind the new barn frame. Pruitt and 2 other ranchers spread along the fence line. A dozen more neighbors he'd come to know these past weeks, scattered careful through the rain-soaked dark, waiting. Odessa stood beside him at the well. Not hiding, not crouching. Standing tall and unmoving in the driving rain like something the storm itself had decided to leave alone. "He's going to come talk first," she said, quiet, certain. Men like Holt always talk first. Need to hear themselves win before they're willing to risk losing. She was right. Holt reined up 30 yards out, his men fanning wide behind him, and even through the rain Elias could see the particular stillness in his face, a man performing calm, because the alternative was admitting how badly tonight could go wrong for him too. "Last chance, Barrow." Holt's voice carried thin and sharp over the wind. "Sign the papers, walk away. Nobody needs to get hurt over a well that was never yours to keep in the first place. It was never yours either." Elias's voice didn't waver. "Or your father's. It belonged to the Ashworth family, still does. We filed the proof in Laramie 6 days ago." Something flickered across Holt's expression, not quite doubt, not yet, but the first crack in a certainty that had carried him his whole life. "Filed papers don't matter tonight." He raised a hand, and behind him, 8 rifles came up in a single, practiced motion. "Tonight only one thing matters: who's still standing come morning." The first shot came from Holt's side, a warning fired high and wide, meant to frighten rather than kill. It did not frighten anyone. What it did was ignite something that had been building in Widow's Basin for 6 long years. Every family that had watched Odessa Ashworth stand guard alone on that ridge. Every rancher whose well had come running clear again these past weeks. Every soul who'd quietly decided, somewhere in the last 9 days, that they were done letting the Holt family decide who got to belong to this valley. Return fire cracked out from 3 separate positions at once. Careful, controlled, aimed to disable rather than kill Amos. Had been insistent on that point during planning. Insistent that whatever else happened tonight, Widow's Basin wasn't interested in becoming a graveyard over this. One of Holt's men went down with a cry, clutching his shoulder. His horse bolted wild into the dark. "Hold!" Holt's voice, sharper now, edged with something that hadn't been there a minute before. "Hold your ground, damn you! We came here to finish this. You came here to burn something that isn't yours." Odessa's voice rang out across the yard, enormous and unshaking, and for one strange suspended moment even the storm itself seemed to quiet around the sound of it. "Same as your father did. Same lie, wearing a different coat." Lightning split the sky directly overhead, illuminating the whole yard in one violent flash. Holt's remaining men, rifles raised but hesitant now, glancing sideways at each other in the way men glance when a plan that sounded reasonable around a campfire has started, in practice, to feel considerably less reasonable. Odessa standing unmoved at the well's edge, rain streaming down a face that held no fear in it at all. Elias beside her, rifle steady, watching the whole valley's fate balance on a knife's edge in the space of a single heartbeat. Then the broad-shouldered man, the same one from the mercantile, from the road to Laramie, lowered his rifle. "Taurus." Holt's voice cracked, sharp with disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing?" "I'm doing arithmetic, Mr. Holt." Torres's voice carried rough and clear even through the storm. "Same arithmetic I've been doing all week, ever since I found your ledger in that satchel so you keep so careful locked away. 8 men, promised 8 full shares for tonight's work. Except your ledger's only got provisions marked out for 2 shares total, which means somebody wasn't planning on all 8 of us riding home from this." The rain seemed to pause, or perhaps it was simply that every other sound in the yard had gone suddenly, terribly quiet. "That's absurd." Holt's composure, so carefully maintained through every prior confrontation, finally visibly cracked. "I don't know what you think you found. I know exactly what I found." Torres turned his horse slightly, putting himself between Holt and the rest of the hired men. "Same thing that happened to the last crew you hired, up in the Cheyenne job, 3 years back. Men went in expecting pay. Only 2 rode out. Rest of them, way I hear it, had a convenient accident on the way home, and somehow their shares never needed paying out at all." Murmurs rippled through Holt's remaining men, low and dangerous, rifles wavering, uncertain now between the ranch ahead of them and the man who'd hired them. "That's a lie." Holt's voice had risen, thin and desperate now, all his earlier cold composure burning away in the rain. "A lie meant to turn you against me, at the worst possible moment. Is it?" Torres reached into his coat, pulled free a soaked, battered ledger, and held it up where the next flash of lightning caught it plain. "Because this looks a great deal like your handwriting, Mr. Holt. And it looks a great deal like a plan to make sure nobody left this valley able to testify about what really happened here tonight. Elias felt something shift in the air, the balance of the whole confrontation tipping, slow and irreversible, away from Holt and towards something neither he nor Odessa had dared hope for when the riders first appeared on the ridge. "Drop your weapons." Torres's voice carried clear across the yard, addressed now to his fellow hired men rather than to Holt at all. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I didn't sign on to die in a rainstorm so this man could save himself the cost of paying us honest." One by one, rifles lowered, not from fear of the ranch's defenders anymore, but from something colder, more personal, the particular fury of men who understood, suddenly and completely, that they'd been treated as disposable by someone they'd trusted enough to follow into danger. Holt sat alone on his horse, surrounded now by men who no longer answered to him, rain streaming down a face that finally entirely lost its careful composure. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice had gone brittle, uncertain. "The land is still mine by law. Whatever these men believe, whatever forged accusations you've cobbled together, it's not forged." Elias stepped forward, rifle still steady, Odessa moving with him like they'd rehearsed it, though they hadn't, though this was simply what 6 weeks of trust had built between them, without either one planning it. "Your father's signature on my father's ruin. Your father's forgery on Odessa's family deed. Filed, permanent, in Laramie, 6 days ago." And now, he nodded, toward Torres, toward the ledger still held up in the rain. "Now we've got proof of exactly what kind of man you learned to be from him." Holt's jaw worked, some final calculation running behind his eyes, weighing options that had all, in the space of 10 violent minutes, collapsed down to nothing worth weighing at all. "You'll regret this," he said, though the threat had lost all its earlier weight, thin now desperate, the last gasp of a man watching his whole inheritance dissolve in the rain. "Both of you." "Maybe," Odessa said, steady, unafraid, "but we'll regret it together, on land that's rightfully ours, in a valley that's finally decided which one of us it wants to stand behind." She took a step closer, rain running down a face that held nothing but hard-won certainty. "Your father buried this well, thinking nothing could ever dig it back up. You came here tonight believing the same thing about your own crimes. You were both wrong." For a long, suspended moment, Bardwell Holt sat alone on his horse in the driving rain, surrounded by men who'd abandoned him, facing a woman his family had spent 30 years trying to erase, and a man whose father he'd never even met but whose ruin he'd inherited anyway. And something in his face finally, completely broke, not into violence, into something smaller, something that looked, in the brief flash of the next lightning strike, almost like the frightened 12-year-old boy who'd once learned kindness was simply patience with a purpose, and had never once, in 20 years since, questioned whether his father's arithmetic had been worth the cost of everything it eventually demanded. He turned his horse without another word and rode back into the storm alone, and nobody moved to stop him, because there was nowhere left for Bardwell Holt to ride that his own choices hadn't already ruined for him. Not everyone in the yard understood, in that first chaotic moment, that the fight was already ending. One of Holt's men, young, frightened, slower than the rest to lower his weapon, fired wild into the dark as Torres's declaration still hung in the rain-soaked air, and the shot went nowhere near its intended target. It went instead toward the well, toward Elias, standing at its edge. Odessa moved before conscious thought could have possibly caught up to instinct. The same overwhelming speed that had thrown a rider from his horse on the Laramie Road, now hurling her own body between Elias and the wild shot, and the bullet meant for empty air, instead caught her high across the arm, tearing through sleeve and skin, both with a violence that dropped her hard to one knee in the mud. Elias's voice cracked raw, all his careful battlefield discipline forgotten in an instant as he dropped beside her, hands finding the wound, finding it bleeding but shallow, a graze deep enough to hurt fiercely but nowhere near deep enough to threaten anything. Beyond considerable pain. "I'm fine." She gritted the words out through clenched teeth, already trying to rise. "Elias, I'm fine. You're not fine. You're bleeding. I've survived worse than a graze." Her hand found his, gripping fierce despite the pain plainly written across her face. "Help me up. We're not finished yet." Around them, the yard had gone eerily still. Every remaining rifle Holt's men and the ranch's defenders both lowered now, in the shared, sudden understanding that violence had just crossed a line nobody present had actually wanted crossed. The young man who'd fired stood frozen, horror plain on his face, his own rifle falling from suddenly nerveless hands. I didn't mean— His voice cracked, young and terrified. I swear, I didn't mean it hit anybody. I know. Odessa's voice, even through gritted teeth, carried something almost gentle. Fear does that. Makes a man's hands do things his heart never intended. Elias helped her rise, keeping pressure firm against the wound. And together, they turned back to face Holt, who sat alone now on his horse, surrounded by men who'd stopped answering to him minutes before and now looked, universally, sick with what their evening had nearly cost. "This is what you built," Odessa said, voice steady despite the blood soaking dark through her sleeve, addressing Holt directly across the rain-churned yard. Fear turned careless, turned violent. "Same as your father before you. You didn't just inherit his money, Bardwell Holt. You inherited exactly the kind of ruin that comes from believing other people's lives are simply arithmetic to be managed." Holt said nothing, had nothing left to say, surrounded by the wreckage of an evening that had, in the span of 10 violent minutes, cost him everything he'd ridden up that trail, believing he still controlled. The storm broke within the hour, the way violent things often do once whatever they were building toward has finally happened. And dawn found Briar Hollow Ranch quiet and rain-washed, under-scrubbed, clean of everything but pale, exhausted light. Elias moved through the yard counting costs. One of Holt's men, wounded in the shoulder, sat wrapped in a blanket near the well, while Odessa tended the injury with a gentleness that surprised him every time he witnessed it, her enormous hands working with a precision that seemed impossible given their size. "You didn't have to help him," Elias said quietly, watching her tie off a clean bandage. "He didn't have to lower his gun either." Odessa didn't look up from her work. Seemed only fair, returning the favor. The wounded man, pale and shaking, looked up at her with an expression Elias recognized the particular bewilderment of someone confronting, for the first time, how wrong 6 years of rumor had gotten something. "They told me you were a monster," he said, voice rough. "In town. Before we ever rode up here. People say a great many things about what they don't understand." Odessa finished the bandage, sat back on her heels. "Doesn't make it true. Just makes it easier than actually looking." The man had nothing to say to that. Just stared at his bandaged shoulder, and then at the woman who'd tended it despite every reason he'd given her not to. And something in his weathered face shifted, slow and permanent, the way understanding sometimes arrives too late to matter and too true to ever forget. Torres approached as Odessa finished, hat in hand, the ledger still tucked careful inside his coat. "I'll take this to the sheriff myself," he said. "Whatever it costs me, admitting I rode up here tonight meaning you harm. Man deserves to answer for planning to have his own hired hands killed rather than paid honest." "Why the change of heart?" Elias asked. "Really?" Torres considered the question a long moment, glancing toward the well, toward the half-built barn, toward the whole slow, patient resurrection of a ranch everyone in Coldwater Flat had once written off as cursed. "I've done a great deal I'm not proud of, working for men like Holt," he said finally. "Told myself it was just business, same as he always told us. But watching you two stand your ground tonight, watching a whole valley choose to stand with you, rather than just watch from a safe distance, I got to remembering. There's a difference between surviving and just being willing to do anything to survive." He settled his hat back on. "Figured it was past time I remembered which one I wanted to be." He rode out with 2 of the other hired men shortly after, bound for the sheriff's office in Coldwater Flat, the ledger and their testimony carried careful between them, while the remaining men scattered to whatever lives waited for them beyond Bardwell Holt's collapsed ambitions. The wounded man stayed behind another hour, until he was steady enough to ride, and before he left, he paused at the fence line, looking back at Odessa with an expression that had shed every trace of its earlier fear. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry. For riding up here at all. For believing what I was told instead of finding out for myself." "You found out," Odessa said simply. "That's worth something." He nodded once, and rode off toward Coldwater Flat, leaving Elias and Odessa, alone in the wet morning light, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of a battle that had, against every reasonable expectation, ended without a single life lost on either side. "We survived it," Elias said, still faintly disbelieving. "We did." Odessa turned to face him, exhaustion and relief and something warmer moving together across her rain-streaked face. "All of us. The valley, too." He pulled her close, careful of her injured shoulder, a shallow graze she'd waved off as inconsequential the moment the fighting ended, though Elias suspected it hurt considerably more than she was willing to admit, and held her there a long, wordless moment in the pale morning light. "It's over," he said. "Not quite." Odessa's voice was tired but certain. "Holt's still out there. Still got money, still got connections in Cheyenne. This won't be finished until the law catches up with him properly. Then we'll see it through," Elias said. "However long it takes." Behind them, the well ran clear and steady in the morning light, untouched by the night's violence, patient as it had always been, waiting the way it had waited 11 long years for somebody willing to fight for its right to keep on running. Bardwell Holt was found 3 days later, holed up in a rented room above the Cheyenne stage office, and did not resist arrest. Word reached Widow's Basin slow, the way important news always seemed to travel across such wide, empty country, first through Amos, who'd ridden to Coldwater Flat to check on Torres, and returned with the full account, then confirmed, more formally, by a letter from Whitfield himself, forwarded from Laramie, detailing the charges now filed against Bardwell Holt in the territorial court: forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder on the strength of Torres's testimony in the ledger he'd carried in himself, unprompted, the same night the storm broke. "He's fighting every charge," Amos reported, settling onto the newly repaired porch steps with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a very old debt finally come due. "Lawyer he's hired says he'll contest it all in front of a jury. Money enough to drag it out, if that's the game he wants to play." "Will a jury believe him?" Odessa asked. Territorial prosecutor. Doesn't seem worried. Amos's weathered face creased with something almost like satisfaction. "Word is Torres's testimony, combined with what you two filed in Laramie, has got the whole Holt operation unraveling faster than anybody expected. Turns out once one man's willing to talk, plenty of others find their own courage too. 3 more ranching families have come forward this week alone, claiming similar forged transfers going back to Josiah's day." Elias felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for weeks. Not quite relief, not entirely, because relief implied the whole ordeal was finished, and some part of him understood it would take considerably longer than a single arrest to fully close a wound 20 years deep. But it was something. A beginning, at least, of the ending he'd hardly dared hope for. "What happens to the land?" he asked. "Officially, now that it's proven the deed was forged." "That," Amos said, producing a second letter from his coat with evident satisfaction, "is the good part." He handed it over, and Elias read it twice, his hands unsteady, before passing it wordlessly to Odessa. The Territorial Land Office, having reviewed the filed evidence and Torres's corroborating testimony, formally recognized the 1,851 grant to Silas Ashworth as the legitimate unbroken chain of title to the land known as Briar Hollow Ranch. All subsequent transfers, including the sale to Elias Barrow, were declared void as products of underlying fraud, though a personal note from Whitfield, appended at the bottom, offered a solution that made Elias's chest go tight with something between amusement and gratitude. Given the circumstances of Mr. Barrow's original purchase, made in good faith and without knowledge of the fraud, and given the considerable improvements made to the property under his stewardship, the office would be pleased to facilitate a new deed reflecting joint ownership between Miss Odessa Ashworth and Mr. Elias Barrow, pending both parties' agreement to such an arrangement. Odessa read the letter slowly, her hands, for the first time since Elias had known her, trembling. "Joint ownership," she said, voice unsteady. "Only if you want it," Elias said quickly. "This is your family's land, Odessa. Your grandfather's grant. I'd understand completely if you wanted it back in the Ashworth name alone. Without Elias." She looked up at him, tears bright and unashamed in her pale eyes. "I've spent 6 years alone on this land, believing it would always just be mine to guard, never mine to actually live on, never mine to build a life on top of. I don't want it back alone. I want it back with you." He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her, slow and certain, right there on the porch steps, while Amos discreetly studied the horizon and pretended not to notice. "Then I suppose, Elias, when they finally broke apart, we'd best go tell Whitfield we accept." Elias and Odessa traveled to Cheyenne 2 months later, when the territorial court finally called Bardwell Holt's case, and sat together in a courtroom crowded with faces from 3 different counties, all of them carrying their own quiet grievances against a family that had spent 30 years teaching an entire territory to fear asking too many questions. Holt sat at the defendant's table looking smaller than Elias, remembered him, the fine coat gone, replaced by something plain and ill-fitting, The easy, cruel confidence that had once carried him up the trail to Briar Hollow, entirely absent now. The prosecution's case took the better part of 2 days. Torres testified first, steady and unflinching, laying out in careful detail exactly what he'd found in that soaked ledger, exactly what Holt had planned for the men who'd trusted him. Whitfield followed, walking the jury through 40 years of forged transfers, patient theft disguised as legitimate business, families ruined one careful signature at a time. Amos spoke of his brother, voice breaking only once, describing 30 years of grief that had never once had anywhere proper to land until now. And finally, Odessa herself took the stand. "Tell the court," the prosecutor said, "what it cost you, personally, watching this family take what belonged to yours." Odessa was quiet a long moment, gathering the words with the same careful patience she brought to everything worth doing properly. "6 years," she said finally, her voice carrying clear and steady across the hushed courtroom. "6 years I stood alone on a ridge, guarding land I didn't understand was rightfully mine, while an entire town called me a monster for the trouble of doing it. 6 years of loneliness, of fear, of believing I'd die on that ridge exactly as alone as I'd live there, all because Josiah Holt decided one afternoon 30 years ago that a dead man's forged signature was worth more than an entire family's whole future." She looked directly at Bardwell Holt, who could not, Elias noted, quite manage to hold her gaze in return. "I don't say this for sympathy," she continued. "I say it because somebody needs to plainly, in a room where it counts. Your family didn't just steal land, Mr. Holt. You stole years, stole the chance for an entire community to trust each other properly, instead of living scared and separate, each ranch alone against whatever came. That's the true cost of what your father built, and what you tried so hard to preserve. Not just water rights. Trust itself, poisoned right alongside the well." The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Guilty on every count, save the murder conspiracy charge, which the prosecutor had always privately conceded would be difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt, given that no actual killing had occurred. 20 years in the territorial penitentiary, along with the forfeiture of every remaining Holt asset land, money, water rights across 3 counties to be distributed, the judge specified, toward restitution for the families his father, and he had spent 3 decades systematically ruining. Bardwell Holt was led from the courtroom without a word, and Elias, watching him go, found himself feeling something he hadn't quite expected. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something closer to the particular relief that comes when a debt 20 years overdue finally, fully, gets paid. "One debt settled," Odessa said softly, as they watched the courtroom slowly empty around them. "One of many, maybe." Elias took her hand. "But a good place to start." They rode back toward Widow's Basin that same week, carrying with them not just the formal verdict, but something considerably more valuable, the quiet, certain knowledge that whatever came next for Briar Hollow Ranch, it would be built on ground finally, truly cleared of everything that had once tried so hard to keep it dead. Amos received his portion of the restitution 3 weeks later, a sum modest compared to what his brother had originally lost, but waited. Elias understood, with considerably more meaning than its dollar value alone could capture. "Wrote to him," Amos admitted, showing up at the ranch with the letter still in hand, his weathered face carrying an expression Elias hadn't seen on him before, something cautiously, carefully hopeful. "First time in 11 years. Told him what happened here. Told him Josiah Holt's finally been made to answer for what his family did to ours." "Do you think he'll write back?" "Don't know." Amos folded the letter carefully away. "But I figured he deserved the chance to know the truth, finally caught up with the man who ruined him, whatever he decides to do with that knowing." He looked out over the ranch, at the well running clear, at the whole slow, patient resurrection of ground everyone had once written off as cursed. Some debts take longer than others to properly settle. Doesn't mean they're not worth the waiting. A reply came, eventually, near the year's end brief. Cautious, but a reply all the same, and Amos rode out to Briar Hollow specifically to share the news, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't often let show. "He's coming to visit," he said. "Spring, maybe. Says he'd like to see the valley again, see what it's become now that it's finally allowed to live." "That's good news, Amos." "It is." The old man's eyes were bright, unashamed. "Best news I've had in 11 years, if I'm honest. Funny thing, watching one well come back to life. Turns out it can start bringing all sorts of other buried things back up along with it." Coldwater Flat held a town meeting the following week, the largest gathering Elias had witnessed since arriving in the territory. Every bench in the small meeting hall filled and more folks standing crowded along the back wall. He hadn't wanted to come at first. Neither had Odessa. If he was honest, 6 years of being the Valley's whispered ghost story had left its own particular scars, ones that didn't heal simply because the law had finally caught up with the man responsible for them. But Amos had insisted. "This town owes you both a reckoning," he'd said, "same as it owes itself one. Folks need to say it out loud, Elias. Not just believe it quiet in the privacy of their own heads. Out loud where it counts." So they'd come, and now stood together at the front of a room that had spent 6 years calling Odessa Ashworth a monster, watching Whitfield himself, who'd made the long ride from Laramie, specifically for this occasion, read the formal territorial ruling into the town's own record. The land known as Briar Hollow, Whitfield read, his voice carrying clear and official across the hushed room, is hereby restored to the rightful Ashworth family line, held now in joint ownership with Mr. Elias Barrow, whose good faith stewardship and considerable improvement of the property the territorial office wishes formally to acknowledge. A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, not hostile, not this time, but something closer to collective relief. The particular sound a whole community makes when a story it's told itself for years finally publicly gets corrected. Mrs. Coyle from the boarding house rose first, her knitting bag still clutched. In one hand, the wedding quilt Amos had mentioned weeks earlier, now visibly further along than it had any business being. "I'd like to say something." Her voice wavered slightly, though her chin stayed lifted, steady. "I've lived in this valley 30 years. Called Miss Ashworth things I'm not proud of, mostly out of fear I never bothered examining too closely. I'd like to apologize. Properly. In front of everyone." Odessa stood very still beside Elias, her hand finding his, gripping tight. "You don't have to," she started. "I do, though." Mrs. Coyle's voice steadied further. "We all do, I think. 6 years. Watching a woman guard a well that turned out to be rightfully hers all along. Protecting water that's kept half this valley alive these past weeks, and the thanks we gave her, most of us, was fear and cruel talk instead of gratitude." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that mostly, carefully, avoided hers in return. "That's not who I want this town to be. Not anymore." One by one, others rose. Pruitt, gruff, brief, simply saying he was grateful his well was running again, and grateful, too, for the neighbor he'd nearly missed the chance to know properly. The rancher who'd spoken up that first day of planning, admitting she'd told her own children frightening stories about the ridge without ever once questioning where those stories had really come from. Even the land office clerk, older now than Elias remembered from his first visit, standing to say, simply, that he was sorry for the $11 joke he'd made at Elias's expense that first day, never imagining what kind of story he was actually joking about. Odessa stood through all of it, tears tracking silent and unashamed down her face, and when the room finally quieted, she spoke for the first time. "I spent 6 years believing I'd always be this valley's ghost story," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady despite the tears. "Something folks whispered about, feared, never really saw. I'd made peace with that, mostly. Told myself it was easier being feared than risking being truly known and rejected anyway." She looked around the room at faces that had once slid away from her and now finally held her gaze instead. "I don't need this town's apology," she said. "Truly, I don't. What happened, happened, and I understand well enough how fear works on people who don't know better, but I'll tell you what I do need." Her voice caught, steadied. "I need you all to know my name now. Really know it. Odessa Ashworth, granddaughter of the man who first proved up this land in 1851. Not a monster, not a ghost story, just a woman who spent 6 years protecting something worth protecting, and finally got to be seen doing it." The room erupted, not into applause exactly, this being a careful, weathered territorial crowd not much given to open displays, but into something warmer, more permanent. A collective easing of 6 years of careful distance finally fully released. Elias watched her, chest tight with something that felt very close to pride, and understood, standing there in that crowded meeting hall, that whatever else came next for Briar Hollow Ranch, this moment alone had been worth every difficult mile of the journey that led them to it. In the weeks that followed, Briar Hollow Ranch became something neither Elias nor Odessa had quite anticipated, not simply a home rebuilt, but the quiet center of an entirely new arrangement taking shape across Widow's Basin. It started with Pruitt, who rode up one afternoon with a proposal so straightforward it took Elias a moment to understand its full weight. "That vein of water," Pruitt said, settling onto the porch steps with the easy familiarity of a man who'd become, these past months, something considerably closer to family than neighbor, runs under half the basin, way Odessa tells it. Which means, way I see it, no single ranch ought to hold a sole claim over water that's keeping a dozen families alive. "What are you suggesting?" Odessa asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "A compact." Pruitt pulled a folded paper from his coat, clearly something he'd been working over careful for some while. "Every ranch drawing off that vein contributes fair, agreed shares toward maintaining the well and the channels. In exchange, every ranch gets guaranteed access, formal, written down, so no single family, not the Ashworths, not the Barrows, not anybody who comes after ever gets to hold the whole basin's water hostage again, the way the Holts tried to." Elias looked at Odessa, watching understanding dawn slow and warm across her face. "Otis would have loved this," she said quietly. "Then let's make it real." Elias took the paper, read through Pruitt's careful, deliberate terms, and felt something settle deep and satisfied in his chest. A water compact, owned by the whole valley, not any single family within it. They spent the following month meeting with ranch after ranch up and down the basin, formalizing what became known, eventually, as the Widow's Basin Water Compact, the first document of its kind in the territory, according to Whitfield, who rode out personally to witness its signing and declared it, with evident satisfaction, precisely the kind of arrangement Josiah Holt had spent 30 years working to prevent. He built an empire on making sure nobody understood how connected they really were, Whitfield observed, watching a dozen ranchers sign their names to the compact in the newly rebuilt barn. Turns out the cure for that particular poison was always just this: neighbors, choosing to remember they were never as separate as fear had convinced them to be. Autumn deepened into winter, and Briar Hollow Ranch settled into a rhythm neither Elias nor Odessa had dared imagine possible when he'd first ridden into a valley everyone called cursed. The barn stood whole again by the season's first snow, sturdier than the original, built with a dozen neighbors' hands instead of one man's alone. The well ran steady through even the coldest months, deep and patient, feeding not just their own herd but, through careful channels Odessa had designed with the same patient attention Otis had once taught her, 3 neighboring ranches besides, and slowly, carefully, something else grew alongside all of it. Elias found himself, one bitter January evening, standing at the same well where they'd shared their first kiss, turning over in his coat pocket a small ring he'd spent 3 weeks working up the courage to have made simple, unadorned, sized careful and precise for hands considerably larger than any jeweler in Coldwater Flat had ever measured before. Odessa found him there, snow settling soft in her dark hair, and something in his expression must have given him away entirely, because she stopped several paces off, studying him with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and sudden, breathless understanding. "Elias Barrow," she said slowly. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Of what?" "You survived Bardwell Holt's hired guns without so much as flinching." That was easier. He crossed the remaining distance between them, the ring suddenly very heavy in his pocket. "Bullets, I understand." This he gestured helplessly at the space between them, at 6 months of grief and rebuilding and slow, hard-won love. "This I've never once gotten right before. Not really, not until you." Odessa's expression softened, all traces of teasing gone. "Ask me," she said quietly. "Whatever it is you're working up the courage to ask. Just ask me." He knelt then, in the snow, at the edge of the well that had brought them together, and held out a ring sized for a hand that had spent its whole life being told it was too much for any ordinary life to hold. "Odessa Ashworth," he said, voice unsteady but certain, "I've buried everything I ever thought I couldn't survive losing. And somehow, impossibly, found something worth being afraid of losing all over again, right here on land that tried its hardest to stay dead and decided instead to live." He held the ring, higher, snow-catching soft in the lamplight. "Will you marry me? Build whatever comes next, together, on ground that finally, truly belongs to us both?" For a long moment, Odessa said nothing at all, tears bright in the cold air, and Elias felt his heart pound loud enough to drown out even the wind. Then she knelt too, folding her considerable height down to meet him eye to eye the way she'd learned, this past year, to fold herself down not from shame anymore, but simply from love. "Yes," she said, voice breaking on the single word. "God help us both. Elias Barrow." "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, precise as he'd hoped, 3 weeks of careful measuring finally proven worthwhile, and kissed her there in the snow, beside a well that had once been declared dead beyond saving. Now the quiet, patient heart of an entire valley's second chance. Winter passed slow and gentle that year, the kind of winter Widow's Basin hadn't seen in over a decade. Snow settling deep and generous over ground that had spent 11 years too dead to properly hold it. Elias spent the quiet months finishing what the barn raising had started, a proper house. This time, built wide and tall enough to comfortably hold 2 people of considerably different size. Every doorway measured careful to Odessa's actual height, rather than some stranger's assumption of ordinary. She'd protested the expense, at first, insisting her cabin on the ridge had suited her fine for 6 years. 6 years alone, Elias had pointed out. This isn't for alone anymore. She hadn't argued further after that. By the time the first green shoots pushed up through ground that had spent so long cracked and barren, the house stood finished, simple, sturdy, built by neighbors who'd learned, this past year, exactly what kind of debt a community owed the people willing to fight for its water. The night before the wedding, Elias rode out alone to the small rise overlooking the ranch, carrying with him a single folded letter he'd been working on, in careful fits and starts, for the better part of a month. He'd never learned Rachel's grave in Kansas, not properly, hadn't had the money or the composure, in those first raw months of grief, to mark it with anything beyond a simple wooden cross that had likely long since weathered away to nothing. But he'd carried her with him anyway. All this distance, all this time. In the particular way grief settles into a person and simply becomes part of how they carry themselves through the world. He read the letter aloud to the darkening valley below, his voice steady despite the tears it cost him. "I used to think loving you again, loving anyone again, would mean somehow loving you less," he said. "Took me a long while to understand that's not how grief actually works. Not the honest kind, anyway. I don't love you less, Rachel, choosing this. I just finally found room enough in what's left of my heart to hold both things at once, what we had, and what I'm building now, with someone who taught me that a person can survive losing everything and still, somehow, find their way back to living fully again." The wind moved soft through the grass around him, carrying nothing but ordinary evening quiet, and Elias sat with his grief a long while longer, honoring it properly one final time, before folding the letter carefully away and riding back down toward the lit windows of the home waiting for him. Odessa was waiting at the door when he returned, understanding without needing to ask exactly where he'd been and why. "Did it help?" she asked quietly, pulling him close. "Yes." He held her, steady and certain. "I think I finally understand what Otis meant. About water finding its way back, no matter how long it's been buried. Grief's like that too, I think. Doesn't disappear. Just finds a new channel to run through, eventually, if you're patient enough to let it. Tomorrow," she said softly, "we build a new channel together." "Tomorrow," he agreed, and held her a long while in the quiet dark, grateful finally, fully for every difficult mile of the journey that had led him here. They were married on a clear morning in early May, in the yard of Briar Hollow Ranch itself, beside the well that had brought them together in the first place. Nearly the whole of Widow's Basin turned out for it. Amos Dell, walking Odessa the short distance from her old cabin to the ceremony site with the careful pride of a man who'd become, over the past year, something very close to family. Pruitt and his wife, their children the same children, whose well had come running clear again the very week Elias first arrived, scattered flowers they'd gathered from the ranch's own, slowly greening pasture. Mrs. Coyle, presiding proudly over the delivery of a quilt that had, indeed, taken her the better part of a year to finish, size generous enough to cover a bed built for 2 people who no longer needed to make themselves smaller for anyone. Whitfield made the long ride from Laramie again, this time not to deliver legal documents but simply to witness, standing near the back of the gathered crowd with an expression of quiet, professional satisfaction that suggested he didn't often get to see his careful paperwork resolve into something this genuinely happy. Odessa wore a dress made by 3 of the town's women working together over several weeks, simple and unadorned but fitted, for the first time in her adult life, to a body that had finally stopped being treated as a problem to be minimized. She walked toward Elias across grass that had been dead scrubland less than a year before, and Elias, watching her come, felt every hard mile of the journey that had led them both here settle into something that finally fully made sense. "You look terrified again," she murmured, once she'd reached him, the small gathered crowd hushing expectant around them. "Good terrified," he said. "The kind that means something's finally worth being afraid of losing." The ceremony itself was brief, simple, conducted by the circuit preacher who rode through Coldwater Flat twice a year and had happily rearranged his whole route to be present for it. But the vows, when they came, carried weight enough to still even the restless spring wind. "I've buried enough in my life to understand exactly what it means to build something worth protecting," Elias said, Odessa's enormous hands held careful and certain in his own. "I promise you this land, this well, this whole slow, hard-won second chance, not because I have to, but because I choose it, every single morning, same as my father once chose to watch the sun rise over ground he'd built with his own two hands." Odessa's voice, when it came, carried steady despite the tears bright in her eyes. "6 years, I stood guard on this ridge, believing I'd always be too much for the world to properly hold," she said. "You proved that wrong every single day since you rode into this valley, unafraid, unflinching, willing to stand beside something the whole world had already decided to call a monster." Her hand tightened around his. "I promise you this land too, Elias. And more than that, I promise you I'll never again mistake being loved for something I need to make myself smaller to deserve." They kissed to the sound of the whole valley's quiet, genuine joy, and somewhere behind them, the well ran clear and steady in the bright spring sunlight, patient witness to two lives that had finally learned how to build something together instead of just surviving alone. The celebration afterward stretched long into the evening, tables set up across the same pasture that would host the Harvest Festival months later. Amos's recruited fiddle player working through every tune he knew twice over, while half the valley took turns dancing across grass that had been dead scrubland barely a year before. Elias danced with Odessa first, careful and laughing, both of them working out the particular logistics of a partnership between such different heights until they found, eventually, an easy rhythm that suited them both, her leading more often than not, if he was honest, though neither of them much minded the arrangement. "I believe this is traditionally the groom's responsibility," she teased, spinning him with an ease that made several onlookers laugh. "Traditionally," Elias agreed. "The groom isn't marrying someone who can lift a fence post one-handed. I'm simply working within my limitations." Mrs. Coyle cornered him near the refreshment table sometime after dark, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman whose long campaign had finally, properly concluded. "Told you that quilt wouldn't go to waste," she said, nodding toward where the finished piece now sat draped, place of honor, over the gift table. "You did," Elias agreed. "I apologize for doubting the timeline. Everyone doubts my timeline." She patted his arm, something unexpectedly warm in the gesture. "I'm rarely wrong, though, about which couples are worth the wool." Whitfield offered the evening's final toast, standing on an overturned crate to be properly seen, his usual careful professional reserve softened considerably by several glasses of Pruitt's homemade cider. "To Briar Hollow Ranch," he said, raising his glass toward the gathered crowd, "and to the two people who taught an entire territory something it badly needed reminding of, that the ground remembers what's owed it, that water finds its way back, no matter how long somebody tries burying it, and that sometimes the people this world decides are too broken, too much, too strange, a shape to properly belong anywhere. Those are exactly the people worth building your whole future around." The toast carried through the gathered crowd, glasses raised high against the darkening sky, and Elias, watching Odessa laugh amid a valley that had once called her nothing but a ghost story, felt his own glass grow heavy with something considerably larger than simple celebration. Gratitude, mostly, for a dead well that had refused to stay buried, and for everyone who'd helped dig it back into the light. They visited Otis Renner's grave together the evening after the wedding. The small family plot behind what had once been Odessa's cabin now maintained careful by them both. Fresh flowers laid regular against weathered stone. "I wish he could have been here today," Odessa said quietly, kneeling to brush new grass, clear from the marker's base. "He was." Elias knelt beside her, resting a hand gentle on her shoulder. "Every doorway in that new house, built tall enough for you, without a second thought, that's him. Every neighbor who showed up today with genuine joy, instead of careful distance, that's him too." In a way, whatever he taught you about listening to ground, about waiting patient for the right person willing to hear it, I think's exactly what today was. Odessa was quiet a long moment, tears tracking soft down her face. He used to say, she said finally, that the ground never really forgets what's owed to it. Water finds its way back, eventually, no matter how long somebody tries burying it. Truth does too, given enough patient digging. She looked up at Elias, something profound and grateful moving behind her pale eyes. I think he'd say the same about people, that the ones worth loving find their way back to each other eventually too, no matter how much the world tries, convincing them they're too broken, too much too strange a shape to ever properly belong anywhere. He sounds like he understood a great deal. He did. She smiled, soft and certain. I only wish I'd told him before he died exactly how much. Elias pulled her close, and they sat together a long while at Otis Renner's grave, the spring evening settling soft and warm around them, until the first stars began appearing overhead, patient and steady, the same stars that had watched over this valley through 11 years of death, and now finally a proper resurrection. Amos's brother arrived 2 weeks after the wedding, stepping down off the Cheyenne stage into a cold-water flat he hadn't laid eyes on in 11 long years, and Elias happened to be in town collecting mail the very afternoon it happened. He recognized the resemblance before Amos even reached the platform's same weathered brow, same careful measuring eyes, though the newcomer's face carried a particular caution that Amos's had long since softened out of. Reuben. Amos's voice cracked on the single word, all his usual gruff composure abandoning him entirely, as he crossed the platform in 3 quick strides and pulled his brother into an embrace that spoke plainer than any words could have managed. 11 years. Reuben's voice was rough, unsteady. 11 years, Amos, and I still nearly turned back twice on the road here. Glad you didn't. So am I. Reuben pulled back, studying his brother's face, with an expression caught somewhere between grief and wonder. You look older. You look like you finally started eating proper again. Amos laughed, wet and unguarded. Come on. There's a whole valley I want you to see. Whole story I want you to hear properly, not just in some letter. Elias offered to accompany them out to Briar Hollow, and the ride back gave Reuben his first real look at the transformed basin green pasture, where he likely remembered nothing but struggling scrub, bland. Wells running clear at ranch after ranch, a whole community visibly, tangibly thriving in ground the Holt family had once worked so patient and cruel to keep broken. This is where it happened, Amos said quietly as they crested the final ridge and Briar Hollow Ranch came into view below, well running clear beside a house built wide and welcoming. Where the well came back, where the truth finally caught up with what Josiah Holt did to us both. Reuben sat his horse a long moment, taking in the sight, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something that had clearly been buried a very long time, finally, cautiously coming up for air. I used to dream about this valley, he admitted. Even after I left, even after I told myself I'd never think of it again. Some nights I'd dream the well running clear, exactly like this, and wake up so disappointed to find it was still just dust and memory, that I nearly stopped letting myself dream at all. It's not memory anymore, Amos said. It's real. Come see. They rode down together, and Odessa met them at the fence, offering Reuben Dell a welcome as warm and unguarded as she'd once feared all those years ago, that no room in this valley would ever properly offer her. Reuben stayed the full week, and by the time he finally boarded the stage back toward whatever life he'd built in the years since his own ruin, he'd already begun asking careful, hopeful questions about whether a man his age might still have some use left in him for honest ranch work, closer to a brother he'd spent 11 years mourning as good as lost. Amos watched the stage depart with tears he made no effort to hide. Another debt settled, he told Elias quietly, though I suspect this one, unlike Holt's, is only just beginning to pay out properly. The basin held its first harvest festival in over a decade that same autumn, an idea Pruitt's wife had proposed almost shyly during one of the water compact meetings, uncertain whether a valley that had spent so many years, suspicious and separate, would actually turn out for something as simple as shared celebration. They needn't have worried. Every ranch along the compact sent something Pruitt's family, bringing 3 wagons of squash and corn grown in soil that had been barren just 2 years before. The Coldwater Flat Mercantile, donating bunting and lanterns. Mrs. Coyle, predictably, arriving with enough baked goods to feed the entire territory twice over, along with proud commentary about the wedding quilt she'd delivered that past spring. The festival sprawled across Briar Hollow's largest pasture. Tables and games, and music from a fiddle player, Amos, had recruited from 3 ranches over, and Elias found himself, midway through the afternoon, simply standing at the edge of it all, watching Odessa laugh, easy and unguarded, surrounded by children from half a dozen families who'd once been taught to fear the shape on the ridge and now, instead, competed eagerly for turns being lifted onto her shoulders to see further across the festival grounds than their own height allowed. Watching Amos trade good-natured insults with Pruitt over a game of horseshoes. Watching Torres invited, somewhat to Elias's own surprise, and accepted by the valley with the particular grace of people who understood redemption, mattered more than perfect histories, helped Mrs. Coyle carry tables, quiet and grateful for a welcome he clearly hadn't expected. A whole valley, gathered together in genuine, uncomplicated joy, on ground that had spent over a decade being called cursed. Quite a sight, Whitfield said, appearing at Elias's shoulder with a plate of Mrs. Coyle's, having made yet another trip out from Laramie, this one entirely unofficial. I've filed a great many land disputes in my years with the territorial office. Never once seen one resolve into something quite like this. Neither had we, Elias admitted. Didn't expect it, if I'm honest. Thought we were fighting for a well. Turned out we were fighting for something considerably larger than that. Odessa found him there a while later, flushed and happy from an afternoon of games and easy company, and settled beside him with a contentment Elias still, even now, found himself faintly disbelieving. "You're doing that thing again," she said, standing back, watching everyone else, like you're not quite sure you're allowed to simply enjoy it. Old habit. He pulled her close. Hard to trust good things sometimes, after enough practice losing them. I understand that better than most. She rested her head against his shoulder, watching the festival's warm chaos spread out before them. But look at it, Elias. A year ago, half these families wouldn't have crossed the street to avoid me. Now they're inviting me to referee their children's foot races. You did that. We did that. She turned to look at him, something fierce and grateful in her expression. Together. Same as everything else. They stayed at the festival until the last lantern burned low, and when the final wagon finally rolled off down the darkening trail, Widow's Basin settled into a quiet that felt, for the first time in longer than either of them could properly measure, entirely peaceful. That autumn, Elias found himself standing again at the top of the ridge trail, where he'd first laid eyes on Widow's Basin, nearly a year to the day since he'd ridden in with nothing left to lose in a paper claiming $11 worth of dead ground. The valley below him now bore almost no resemblance to that first bleak vision. Green pasture stretched where cracked earth had once refused to hold anything at all. The barn stood whole and proud beside a house built wide enough for 2 very different kinds of grief to finally, fully, heal into something else. And scattered across the wider basin, visible even from this distance, wells ran clear at ranch after ranch, connected now not just by the ancient vein running silent beneath them all, but by a compact of neighbors who'd learned, the hard way, exactly how much stronger they were standing together than any single family had ever managed standing alone. Odessa rode up to join him, her horse considerably larger than his own, bred specifically for her particular size, a gift from Pruitt that had taken the whole valley's collective effort to properly negotiate with a horse trader in Cheyenne. Settling easy beside him at the ridge's edge. "Remembering something," she said. "Not quite a question. The first day I saw this place." Elias's voice carried soft, reflective. "Thought I was looking at a grave. Thought maybe that suited me fine, given everything I'd already buried. And now?" He looked at her, really looked, the autumn light catching gold and warm across features that had become, this past year, as familiar and beloved to him as his own reflection, and felt the whole weight of everything they'd built together settle into something that finally, fully, made sense. "Now I understand," he said, "that some ground just needs the right person patient enough to dig deep enough to find what's still alive underneath everything, trying to convince you otherwise." Odessa's hand found his, steady and certain, the ring he'd given her catching soft in the fading light. "Otis used to say something similar," she said, "about people too, not just wells. I remember. You told me, I know." She smiled, warm and unguarded. Every fright that careful woman he'd first met on that ridge had slowly, patiently learned to become. I just like saying it out loud now, reminding myself it's true. Below them, Widow's Basin spread wide and green and thoroughly, permanently alive. wells running clear across a valley that had spent 11 long years learning how to die, and had finally, thanks to two people the world had once written off as broken beyond repair, remembered instead exactly how to live. The wind came then, same as it had the very first day. Elias rode into this valley, sweeping soft across the ridge where they sat together. But it carried no dust now. No dead grass, no bitter chemical taint of poison long buried and half forgotten. Just the clean green smell of pasture grown thick and generous, and somewhere beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the cool, mineral breath of water running steady through veins that had spent over a decade, convinced they'd never run again. Do you remember? Odessa asked softly. What I told you, that very first day? Standing in my garden, certain you'd made the worst decision of your life buying this ground, I remember. Elias's mouth curved, warm with the memory. You told me I'd bought a grave, that I belonged to it now, whether I understood that or not. I meant it as a warning. I know. He turned to look at her, this remarkable woman, who'd spent 6 lonely years guarding a truth she hadn't even known was hers to guard, who'd thrown herself into the path of a falling tree and a stray bullet both, rather than let this valley claim one more thing she loved. You were right, though. I did belong to it. Just not in the way either of us understood, standing there that first frightened day. How do you understand it now? Elias considered the question a long moment, watching the wind move soft and green across a valley that had taught him, this past year, more about grief and healing and hard-won love than the whole rest of his life combined. I think, he said finally, that belonging was never about the land owning me, never about some curse, some grave, some dead well, swallowing up whatever I brought to it. He took her hand, steady and certain, the ring he'd given her catching soft in the fading autumn light. I think it was always about this, about choosing every single morning to stay and fight for something worth saving, alongside someone we're staying for. The ground didn't claim me, Odessa. You did, this valley did, and I've never once regretted letting it. Odessa's eyes filled, soft and unashamed, and she leaned down, folding her considerable height toward him, with the same careful tenderness she'd shown him from the very beginning, and kissed him there at the ridge's edge, the whole resurrected basin spread golden and thriving beneath them. They sat together a long while afterward, watching the autumn sun settle slow toward the horizon, painting the whole valley gold, and neither one of them, for the first time in either of their long, difficult lives, felt even the smallest urge to look away. Below, the well ran on, patient, steady, alive, exactly as it had always been waiting to become, if only somebody had been brave enough and stubborn enough, and finally fully willing to love enough, to dig deep enough and stay long enough to bring it home.